The paradox appears when Socrates suggests they should investigate what virtue is before they try to figure out if it can be taught. Meno pushes back with a sharp question. How can you inquire into something when you don't even know what it is? If you already know it, then there's no need to inquire. But if you don't know it, then how would you recognize it when you find it? Either way, you won't learn anything new. That's the trap. The paradox rests on two key ideas. First, that you can't search for what you already know. Second, that you can't search for what you don't know either, because you wouldn't even know where to begin or how to tell if you're right. It draws a hard line. Learning seems impossible, because every attempt to learn is either useless or impossible. To see this more clearly, imagine a person who wants to find out what a quark is, but has never heard the word. They don't know it's a particle, or part of physics, or that it's even a real thing. If they walk into a library and look at books randomly, how would they know when they found the right answer? They wouldn't even know what to look for. On the other hand, if they already know what a quark is, then looking it up isn't discovery, it's review. Socrates responds to the paradox with a strange idea. He introduces the theory of recollection. According to him, the soul is immortal and has learned everything in past lives. Learning in this life is just remembering what the soul already knows. This view shifts the paradox. Instead of learning something new, you're recovering knowledge that your soul once had but forgot. That's why you can recognize truth when you find it, even if you don't consciously know it yet. To prove this, Socrates gives a demonstration. He calls over a slave boy who has never studied geometry. Through a series of questions, Socrates leads the boy to realize a geometric truth about doubling the area of a square. The boy doesn't guess randomly. Socrates doesn't tell him the answer, but through guided questioning the boy figures it out. Socrates argues this shows the boy had the knowledge hidden inside him and only needed the right questions to draw it out. But this doesn't fully solve the paradox. Even if the soul remembers, that doesn't explain how humans first came to know things. And the theory of recollection is tied to Plato's metaphysics, which not everyone accepts. It assumes a soul, past lives, and an eternal world of perfect forms. Many modern thinkers find these ideas hard to accept. A more grounded way to think about the paradox is to shift the focus to partial knowledge. Maybe we never start from zero. When we're curious about something, we often know just enough to get started. A person might not know what a quark is, but they might have heard it mentioned in a science video or seen the word in a textbook. That small piece of context gives a foothold. They can ask targeted questions, search physics books, or talk to someone who studies science. Bit by bit, they build knowledge. Another example is a person learning a new language. They might not know the grammar, but they can recognize patterns in sound or meaning. A child doesn't start with total ignorance. They hear words over and over in context. Eventually, they begin to connect sounds to actions, objects, or feelings. Even without formal teaching, they form working models of the language. It's not magic. It's pattern recognition, repetition, and a feedback loop of trial and error. In modern terms, the paradox points to an important distinction between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is knowing that something is the case, facts, definitions, names. Procedural knowledge is knowing how to do something. You might not be able to explain how to balance on a bicycle, but you can do it. People often start learning by mimicking, experimenting, or observing, even when they can't explain what they're doing yet. In these cases, they're not searching blindly. They're trying things and refining them based on the outcome. There's also a cognitive principle known as hypothesis testing. When we face something unfamiliar, we form rough guesses about it. We test those guesses and we adjust them. This is how young children learn to interact with the world. They try to stack objects, open doors, or copy sounds. When something works, it gets reinforced. When it fails, they try something else. Over time, their models of the world improve. This process isn't full ignorance followed by sudden knowledge. It's gradual refinement. Meno's paradox exaggerates the problem by pretending knowledge comes in complete units. You either have it or you don't. But most learning doesn't work that way. Instead, knowledge often comes in layers. You might know a little, then build on that. You might understand something vaguely, then later connect it to other ideas. You can also know pieces of something but not see the whole picture until later. For example, a person might understand that gravity pulls things down and also know that the moon orbits the Earth. But they may not connect both ideas until they study orbital mechanics. Learning is often about forming connections between things you already partly understand. The paradox also assumes that recognition is impossible without prior knowledge, but in reality humans are good at pattern recognition, even without knowing the rules behind what they see. A person can listen to a piece of music they've never heard and still notice repetition, harmony, or emotion. They might not be able to name the chords or the structure, but they can still engage with it, and even predict parts of it. This kind of engagement doesn't require full knowledge, it only needs sensitivity to structure. There's also a practical layer to inquiry. Even when you don't know the answer, you often know what type of thing you're looking for. If someone wants to know how bees make honey, they might not know the answer, but they know to look at bee behaviour, flowers, or the hive. That narrows the search. Inquiry works because questions often contain clues about where to begin. The shape of the question guides you. Meno's paradox remains powerful because it forces us to think about how learning starts. But it doesn't actually block learning. It just shows that learning doesn't start from nowhere. It starts from a mix of curiosity, fragments of knowledge, past experience, and the ability to recognize when something makes sense. Socratic questioning, trial and error, analogy, guided discovery. All these methods allow people to move from what they know to what they don't know. The paradox loses its force when we accept that knowledge doesn't need to be all or nothing. Fitch's paradox begins with an idea that seems harmless at first. All truths are knowable. This is sometimes called the knowability thesis. Philosophers proposed it as a way to bridge the gap between truth and knowledge. If something is true, then it must be possible for someone at some point to know it. The idea doesn't say that everyone knows everything or that we will know all truths eventually. It just says that no truth is completely beyond the reach of knowledge forever. But in 1963, philosopher Fitch showed that if we assume this modest claim, it leads to a very strange and unwanted conclusion, that all truths are already known. This is Fitch's paradox. To understand why this is a problem, start with the basic difference between truth and knowledge. Something can be true even if no one knows it. For example, there might be a planet in a distant galaxy with liquid water. That fact could be true right now, but humans might never discover it. The knowability thesis simply says that it's at least possible to know it, even if no one actually does. This thesis was meant to support the idea that truth is always in principle accessible, not mysterious or locked away forever. Fitch's proof starts by formalizing the thesis. He uses modal logic, a system that allows reasoning about possibility and necessity. In this logic, the knowability thesis becomes a statement like, if P is true, then it is possible to know P. That is, P arrow KP, where arrow means it is possible that, and K means it is known that. Fitch showed that from this modest assumption, we can logically derive something much stronger. If a proposition is true, then it is known. That means P to KP. If all truths are knowable, then all truths are known. But that can't be right. There are clearly many truths that are not known. People don't know the number of hairs on Napoleon's head at birth. That number is fixed and therefore true, but it is lost to history. No one knows it now, and no one ever will. According to Fitch's result, this kind of truth shouldn't exist. So either the knowability thesis is wrong, or something went wrong in the reasoning. To see how the paradox works, consider a special kind of truth, a truth that is unknown. Suppose we have a statement P that is true and not known. Then consider the compound statement. P is true and not known. Symbolically, this is P and not KP. Now, If all truths are knowable, then this compound statement must also be knowable. That means KP and not KP. Here's where the contradiction comes in. If someone comes to know that P is true and not known, then they know P, and they know that they didn't know P, which is no longer true. The act of knowing the statement destroys its own truth. It's like trying to prove that a secret is unknown. Once you demonstrate it, it becomes known, and therefore false as a secret. So P and not KP cannot be knowable, even though we assumed all truths are knowable. This creates a contradiction. The root of the paradox lies in the way knowledge interacts with negation. Some truths, like "no one knows this," lose their truth when someone knows them. These are called epistemically fragile truths. Their truth depends on being unknown. Fitch's paradox shows that if all such truths were knowable, they would be knowable only in a self-defeating way. So not all truths can be knowable, at least not in the simple sense we assumed. This result has wide consequences. It challenges the assumption that truth and knowledge are always in sync. It also forces philosophers to reconsider what we mean by knowable. There are a few different responses to the paradox. Some philosophers reject the idea that all truths are knowable. They say that some truths, especially ones involving statements about their own unknowability, just can't be known. Others reject the kind of logic that Fitch used, especially the assumptions behind how knowledge operators work in modal logic. One approach tries to save the knowability thesis by restricting the kinds of truths it applies to. Maybe not every truth must be knowable, only the non-paradoxical ones. For example, maybe the thesis only covers normal truths, like facts about biology, history, or math. Self-referential statements like, "this truth is unknown," would be excluded. But this kind of fix seems arbitrary. How do you draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable truths? And what principle tells you where to stop? Another approach questions the definition of knowledge. In Fitch's argument, knowing a statement means knowing that the statement is true. But in real life, people often believe things, act on them, and even build systems of knowledge without this strict form of knowing. Some suggest that we should treat knowledge more flexibly, as a process or capacity, not as a binary state. If so, the logic behind the paradox might not capture what we mean by knowable in practice. The paradox also intersects with debates in epistemology about realism and anti-realism. Realists believe that truth exists independently of what anyone knows or can know. Anti-realists believe that truth is tied to what is in principle knowable or verifiable. Fitch's result pressures the anti-realist side. If truth and knowability are tightly linked, then the anti-realist must either accept that all truths are known, which is clearly false, or admit that not all truths are knowable, which undercuts their view. So the paradox becomes a tool to test different theories of truth. There are parallels in other fields as well. In computer science, especially in areas like formal verification, a similar tension arises. Some properties of systems are undecidable, not because they aren't real or meaningful, but because no algorithm can confirm them in all cases. In information theory, some data is encoded in ways that can't be decoded, without destroying the original state. These analogies don't solve Fitch's paradox, but they suggest that limits on knowability are not unique to logic or philosophy. A simple version of the paradox appears in real life when people try to keep secrets or detect lies. Imagine someone says, "No one knows my password." If you then say, "I know your password is banana123, then the statement becomes false. Your act of knowing it cancels out its truth. This doesn't seem strange in daily life, but in logical form it creates a contradiction. Once again, knowledge reshapes the truth it refers to. Another example comes from thought experiments about surveillance. Suppose a person says, "No one is watching me right now." If a hidden camera is watching them, then the statement is false, even if the person doesn't know it. But what if someone could know that the statement is true? They'd have to verify that no one, including themselves, is watching, which defeats itself. The act of checking spoils the claim. Fitch's paradox captures this dynamic in abstract form. The result is not a flaw in logic, but a warning. It shows that our assumptions about knowledge, possibility, and truth can combine in ways that break down under pressure. Fitch's paradox remains a sharp test for any system that tries to explain how truth connects to knowledge. It demands careful thinking about how far knowledge can go, and whether some truths are forever out of reach, not because they're false, but because knowing them cancels them out. Frege's paradox is not as well known as some other logical or philosophical puzzles, but it addresses a deep issue in language, identity, and meaning. It comes from the work of Gottlob Frege, a 19th century German logician and philosopher of language. Frege was trying to understand how language works, especially how names refer to things, and how different sentences can express the same truth while still conveying different information. In doing so, he ran into a puzzle involving identity statements, sentences that say one thing is the same as another. His attempt to solve this problem laid the foundation for much of modern logic and semantics, but it also opened up a new set of problems. Frege noticed something strange about identity statements. Suppose you have two names, Clark Kent and Superman. Both refer to the same person, so if someone says Clark Kent is Superman, they're making a true statement. But that sentence doesn't feel like the same as Clark Kent is Clark Kent. The second is a simple tautology, something that is always true and tells you nothing new. But the first sentence feels informative. If you didn't already know that Clark Kent and Superman are the same person, hearing that fact gives you new knowledge. This creates a problem. If both names refer to the same object, then why do the two sentences differ in meaning or cognitive value? Frege saw this in more abstract terms using examples from mathematics and astronomy. Take the statements, "The morning star is the morning star and the morning star is the evening star." Both refer to the planet Venus. Yet, the second statement surprised ancient astronomers when they learned it, while the first one is obvious. The issue is that both names point to the same object, but the second sentence still communicates something new. This contradicts the idea that a name's meaning is just the object it refers to. This led Frege to distinguish between two components of meaning, sense and reference. The reference of a term is the object it points to in the world. The sense is the way in which the term presents that object. So, morning star and evening star have the same reference, Venus, but different senses, the way Venus appears in the morning versus the evening. The sense provides the mental route to the reference. That's why identity statements can be informative. They equate two senses that happen to have the same reference. Frege's move solved part of the puzzle, but it introduced a deeper problem, now called Frege's paradox or sometimes Frege's puzzle. The paradox becomes sharp when you look at sentences that embed these identity statements in more complex thoughts. For example, suppose Lois Lane believes that Superman can fly, but she does not believe that Clark Kent can fly. If we assume that both names refer to the same person, and that belief is just a relation between a person and a proposition, then we get into trouble. On one reading, both Superman can fly and Clark Kent can fly express the same proposition since both names refer to the same person. That means Lois believes both, which is false. She clearly believes one and not the other. But if we say that the two sentences express different propositions because they use different names with different senses, then it seems like reference isn't enough to determine the content of a belief. This forces us to rethink how language connects to thought. The core of Frege's paradox is this tension. How can names refer to the same thing and still carry different meanings? And if they do carry different meanings, how does that affect logical systems built on the idea that statements are just combinations of names and predicates? This problem becomes especially serious in formal logic. In standard first-order logic, names are treated as constants. If A is equal to B, then anything true about A is also true about B. This principle is called substitutivity of identicals, but natural language doesn't always allow that. If Lois believes that Superman can fly, we can't substitute Clark Kent for Superman, in her belief without changing the truth value of the belief. That breaks the rules of standard logic. So Frege's paradox shows that natural language beliefs don't behave like formal logic. This issue gets even more difficult when we deal with propositional attitudes, mental states like belief, desire, fear, or hope. These involve a subject and a proposition. If we take these propositions to be simply about the reference of terms, then we can't account for the different mental reactions people have to the same object under different descriptions. But if we take propositions to include senses, then belief becomes more subjective and harder to analyse logically. To deal with this, philosophers and logicians have developed several strategies. One is Frege's own solution, which involves treating belief reports as involving the sense of the names rather than just their reference. But this makes belief highly context-dependent and complicates logical systems. Another is the idea of structured propositions, where the content of a belief includes the specific linguistic or conceptual components used to form it. This keeps the differences between Superman and Clark Kent, even when the reference is the same. Yet another approach is called possible world semantics. Here, belief is not just about truth in the actual world, but about truth across possible worlds. Lois believes that Superman can fly if, in all the possible worlds compatible with her beliefs, the person she calls Superman can fly. Since she doesn't know that Clark Kent is the same person, there are worlds where Clark Kent can't fly. This accounts for the difference without giving up the idea that both names refer to the same person. Frege's paradox also relates to puzzles about informative identity. When people learn that two names refer to the same thing, they gain information, even though the reference doesn't change. This kind of learning is not just about discovering a fact about the world, but also about updating the relationships between concepts in the mind. The paradox forces us to see that meaning is not only about reference. It also involves structure, perspective, and mental framing. This insight changed the direction of philosophy of language. It led to questions about how sentences get their meaning, how communication works, and how thought can be modelled. Later philosophers like Saul Kripke challenged Frege's ideas by introducing the concept of rigid designators, names that refer to the same object in every possible world, regardless of sense. Kripke rejected Frege's view that sense determines reference, and instead proposed that names refer directly. But even in Kripke's framework, Frege's paradox lingers. People still react differently to Superman and Clark Kent, even if both are rigid designators for the same person. So the paradox remains unresolved. It shows that language is not a simple code, where each word maps neatly onto a thing in the world. Instead, it is layered, flexible, and full of distinctions that matter in thought and conversation. Frege's paradox continues to influence debates about how meaning works, how logic should be structured, and how human minds deal with information. Yablo's paradox is a logical puzzle created by philosopher Stephen Yablo in the early 1990s. It challenges the idea that all paradoxes involving self-reference must contain direct self-reference. In traditional paradoxes like the liar paradox, a sentence refers directly to itself, saying something like, "This sentence is false." That direct loop causes trouble. If the sentence is true, then what it says must hold, so it's false. But if it's false, then what it says isn't true, which means it's true. Either way, it contradicts itself. That's the classic loop of the liar. Yablo set out to show that paradoxes don't need that kind of tight loop. He constructed a series of sentences, each of which refers not to itself, but to all the sentences that come after it. The surprising result is that the paradox still appears, even though no sentence says anything about itself. The structure creates an infinite chain of references that avoids direct self-reference, but still leads to contradiction. This shifted how philosophers think about paradoxes and self-reference in logic. To understand how it works, imagine an infinite list of sentences, S1, S2, S3, and so on. Each sentence says, all the sentences after this one are not true, so S1 says that S2, S3, S4, and so on are all not true. S2 says that S3, S4, S5, and so on are all not true. Each sentence points forward, not back. No sentence talks about itself or earlier ones. The reference flows in one direction, down the list. At first glance, this structure seems harmless. After all, each sentence is only talking about others. But when you try to assign truth values to these sentences, things fall apart. Suppose, just to start somewhere, that S1 is true. That means all the sentences after it, S2, S3, S4, and so on, are not true, so S2 is not true. But what does it mean for S2 to be not true? S2 says that all the sentences after it are not true. So if S2 is not true, then that must be false. It's not the case that all later sentences are untrue. That means at least one of them must be true. Let's say S3 is that one true sentence. Then by the same logic, all the ones after S3 must be false. But we already assumed S2 is false, and now we have S3 as true. But S2 said that S3 and all the others are false. That was consistent with our earlier assumption, so maybe we think we're safe. But then S4 is one of the later sentences after S3. If S3 is true, then all of S4, S5 and beyond must be false. But then we get back into a pattern. If any sentence after S1 is true, then all those that follow it must be false, including the one we just said was true. The contradiction builds up again. Try reversing it. Suppose all sentences S1, S2, S3 and so on are false. That means S1 is false, but S1 says that all later sentences are false. If S1 is false, then it is not the case that all later sentences are false, so at least one of them is true. Let's call it SK. But then we're back to where we started. Any true sentence forces the rest of the chain to be false, which in turn would justify earlier ones being true. This infinite push and pull never settles. Any attempt to assign consistent truth values fails. The core of the paradox is this: no sentence says, "I am not true." Each one says that the rest are not true. That seems like it should be safe. But the whole setup creates a kind of indirect self-reference. The network of references bends back on itself, not in a direct loop, but in a spiral. It's like each person on a staircase pointing at the people below them and saying, none of those people is telling the truth. You can go down the staircase forever, but no step is free from contradiction. Yablo's goal was to show that paradox doesn't require self-reference. It can arise from a certain structure of dependency, even when no single item talks about itself. The result shakes assumptions in formal logic, especially those tied to theories of truth. Many classic responses to paradoxes focused on blocking self-reference. They said things like, no sentence can refer to itself, or no system can contain its own truth predicate. Yablo's construction sidesteps those solutions. It shows that even without self-reference, trouble can still emerge. This causes problems for formal systems that try to describe truth in a precise way. In logic, truth predicates are statements like, it is true that, or the sentence X is true. If paradox can arise even without letting a sentence say anything about itself, then banning self-reference isn't enough. You have to look more carefully at how sentences are allowed to refer to others, even indirectly. Some systems try to fix this by putting restrictions on what kinds of reference are allowed, or by building hierarchies of language. These hierarchies say that sentences in one level can only talk about sentences at a lower level. That keeps loops from forming, but those restrictions often feel artificial. In normal language, people freely say things like, everything my brother says is false, or the next speaker will tell the truth. These are natural statements, but they cause trouble in formal logic if they build the wrong kind of chain. Yablo's paradox also connects to foundational work in mathematics. The structure of the paradox resembles Gödel's incompleteness theorems, where certain true statements cannot be proven within a system. Gödel used a kind of indirect self-reference to show that arithmetic contains true but unprovable statements. Yablo shows that similar instability arises just from a sequence of statements about others, without any sentence turning back on itself. The result supports the idea that logic, truth and proof are more fragile than they appear. There are real-world analogies. Imagine a row of judges. Each judge says that all the judges sitting farther down the row are corrupt. None accuses themselves. Each only looks forward. But the total setup creates a logical mess. If one judge is telling the truth, then all the ones after them must be corrupt. But then the judge just before them is wrong, because not all judges after them are corrupt. The chain collapses no matter where you start. No consistent assignment of honesty and dishonesty can match what the judges claim. Another version happens in gossip. One person says, "Everyone who tells you a rumour after me is lying." If the next person says the same, and the next, and the next, you can't tell who's being honest. The structure creates a paradox, even though no one is talking about themselves. Yablo's paradox is not just a curiosity. It has forced logicians to rethink how they define truth, how they allow sentences to relate to each other, and how they draw boundaries around valid reasoning. It has also added depth to the study of infinite sequences, dependency, and circularity in formal systems. Even though each sentence seems safe on its own, the total system is unstable. That shows that paradox can be structural, not just local. Ultrafinitism is a radical stance in the philosophy of mathematics. It challenges not just the idea of infinity, but also large finite numbers. Where classical mathematics accepts infinite sets, like the set of natural numbers, and even allows reasoning about numbers far beyond what we could ever write down or compute, ultrafinitism takes a much stricter view. It claims that numbers only exist if they can be explicitly constructed or grasped within some physical or mental limit. This means that numbers like 10100010 to the power of 1000, or even 10100010 to the power of 100, might not count as legitimate mathematical objects, depending on how strict the ultrafinitist is. The core of the ultrafinitist challenge is this: should mathematics rely on concepts that are fundamentally unreachable, unprovable, or unrealizable? In classical logic and set theory, infinity plays a central role. The natural numbers go on forever. We prove theorems about all primes, even though we will never check each one by hand. We accept that there are infinitely many points between any two numbers. But the ultrafinitist doubts whether these kinds of statements make sense. For them, a number or object is only meaningful if it can be named, written, computed, or visualized in a concrete way. The mere assumption of infinite totalities is seen as metaphysical or speculative. Consider how this view differs from other schools of thought. Classical mathematics treats numbers abstractly. It allows for objects that no human will ever see. Intuitionists like Brewer also rejected some uses of infinity, especially the idea that all mathematical statements are either true or false, even when we can't prove them. But intuitionists still accepted the existence of all natural numbers in principle. Ultrafinitists go further. They reject numbers if they are too large to be represented within real-world bounds. Suppose a mathematician writes, "Let n is equal to 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10, n is equal to 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10. In classical mathematics, this is valid. It defines a number even though it's unimaginably huge. An ultrafinitist might ask, how do you know this number exists? Can you write it out? Can you compute with it? Can you store it in memory? If not, then how is it any different from invoking a fictional object? In their view, abstract definitions are not enough. You need evidence of existence through construction. This idea pushes mathematics toward a form of strict constructivism. It resembles computational thinking, where an object only counts if it can be handled by a finite process. Ultrafinitists sometimes point to real-world constraints, such as the size of the universe or the number of particles in it, to argue that certain numbers cannot be constructed even in principle. For example, you cannot store a string of 100,100,000,010 to the power of 1,000 digits, because there isn't enough matter or time in the universe to do so. If that number cannot be realized even theoretically, why should it be accepted? One way to see the implications is through algorithms. In classical complexity theory, we say that an algorithm is efficient if it runs in polynomial time, but we also study algorithms that take exponential time or more. Ultrafinitists might argue that certain computations, those involving enormous numbers, aren't just impractical, they are meaningless. For instance, consider the statement, there exists a prime number larger than 10 to the power of 1000. Classical number theory accepts this. There are infinitely many primes. But an ultrafinitist could ask, how would you ever confirm such a prime exists? If no method can produce it within physical bounds, is the statement about it even coherent? This leads to a challenge for proofs. Many proofs in mathematics use contradiction. Assume some object exists, derive a contradiction, and conclude that the object doesn't exist. These proofs often rely on infinite sets or very large numbers. Ultrafinitists question whether such arguments are valid if the objects involved can't be constructed. If you prove something about all natural numbers, but your proof depends on values beyond what can be written down or tested, then an ultrafinitist might reject the result. They want mathematics to stay grounded in the physically and cognitively realizable. There's also a psychological side to this. Some ultrafinitists argue that our concept of number should match what the human mind can actually grasp. Beyond a certain size, the distinction between different numbers becomes meaningless. Most people can't tell the difference between 10 to the 100th power and 10 to the 101st power in any practical way. So why treat them as distinct entities if no one can work with them? In this view, mathematics is not just a logical system, it's a human activity, and its boundaries should reflect human capacities. One consequence is that some parts of traditional mathematics would collapse. Many areas rely on quantifiers like for all or there exists applied to large or infinite domains. Ultrafinitism would force mathematicians to rethink those concepts. They might need to redefine for all x as for all x less than some constructible bound b. Proofs would need to show how each case up to b can be handled. This turns abstract general statements into explicit finite procedures. The challenge goes deeper in number theory. Consider Fermat's last theorem. It says that for any integer n greater than 2 and 2, there are no three integers aa, bb and cc such that n plus n equal to kn plus ben is equal to cn. Andrew Wiles proved this using modern tools from algebraic geometry and modular forms. The proof is valid in classical mathematics, but for an ultrafinitist the proof might be suspect. It makes claims about all natural numbers, but if the theorem makes a claim about numbers larger than what can ever be constructed or verified, does it really hold in an ultrafinitist framework? Another example is the halting problem. Turing showed that there is no general algorithm to determine whether every program halts. This result involves quantifying over all possible Turing machines and inputs. But ultrafinitists might question whether those machines and inputs exist in any meaningful sense if their size exceeds the limits of computation. The halting problem might be irrelevant from their point of view, since they don't accept the validity of the infinite search space in the first place. Critics of ultrafinitism argue that it's too restrictive. They say it removes the beauty and power of mathematics by chaining it to physical limits. Much of modern math explores ideas far beyond what any person or machine can realize. That's the whole point. Abstraction allows us to reason about things we can't see directly. It opens the door to new insights, new structures, and even practical applications. Without these abstractions, entire fields like analysis, topology, or abstract algebra would have to be rewritten or discarded. Supporters respond that most applications of mathematics rely on computation, measurement, and proof systems that are already finite. In practice, engineers, scientists, and computer scientists don't deal with infinities. They approximate, simulate, and build finite models. From this perspective, ultrafinitism reflects how mathematics is really used. It strips away the metaphysics and keeps math tied to experience. Ultrafinitism is not popular among working mathematicians, but it has gained some attention in logic and philosophy. It challenges assumptions that go unquestioned in most mathematical work, It also aligns with certain trends in theoretical computer science, where people study what can be computed under hard physical constraints. As computers get faster and datasets get larger, the boundary between the computable and the uncomputable becomes more visible. Ultrafinitism asks us to take that boundary seriously, not as a technical inconvenience, but as a foundational limit on what mathematics can claim. Skolem's paradox is a strange result that comes from trying to understand how set theory behaves when it's viewed through formal logic. At its core, the paradox exposes a conflict between what set theory seems to say about the existence of uncountable sets and what model theory says about the possible models of set theory. The result doesn't involve a logical contradiction in the strict sense, but it creates a deep tension in how we think about mathematical structures, especially when we move from informal intuition to formal logic. Set theory, especially the version called Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, or ZEF, forms the foundation of most of modern mathematics. It allows mathematicians to talk about collections of objects, infinite sets, functions, and numbers in a consistent way. One of its most famous results is Cantor's proof that some sets are uncountable. For example, the set of real numbers is uncountable, meaning there's no way to list all of them using natural numbers. This result seems clear and is accepted across mathematics. You cannot map all real numbers onto the natural numbers without missing some, so the real numbers form a larger infinity than the set of natural numbers. Now comes the twist. Thoralf Skolem, a Norwegian mathematician and logician, showed that if set theory is consistent, then it has a countable model. That is, there exists a model of ZF where the domain, the universe of objects that the theory talks about, is a countable set. That model still contains a version of the real numbers, and inside the model, the real numbers satisfy all the axioms and properties we expect. The model even believes that its set of real numbers is uncountable. But from the outside, meaning from the point of view of someone looking at the model as a mathematical object, the set is countable. This is the heart of Skolem's paradox. Set theory proves that uncountable sets exist, yet logic shows that a countable model of set theory can contain a version of those uncountable sets. The paradox is not that there is a contradiction in the theory. There isn't. It's that our understanding of what uncountable means depends on whether we're inside the model or outside of it. From inside, the set of real numbers looks uncountable. From outside, the entire model, including its version of the real numbers, is countable. To make sense of this, we need to look at what countable really means in logic. A set is countable if there is a one-to-one correspondence between its elements and the natural numbers. In ordinary mathematics, the rational numbers are countable because we can list them in a clever sequence. The real numbers are not countable because Cantor proved that no list can capture all of them. But in formal logic, when we talk about models, we're talking about sets of symbols and formulas that satisfy certain properties. A model of set theory is just a structure that satisfies all the axioms of ZF. Now consider the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem. It says that if a first-order theory has an infinite model, then it has a countable model. ZF is a first-order theory, and if it's consistent, it must have at least one model. So the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem guarantees that a countable model of ZF exists. That model is built from a countable set of objects. But because the language of ZF only talks about the relationships between sets, not about their size in a higher sense, the model can contain sets that it treats as uncountable, even if from the outside they're part of a countable set. That's what makes this result paradoxical. The model behaves as though uncountable sets exist. It has all the right definitions. It satisfies the axiom of power set. It satisfies Cantor's diagonal argument. Within the model, it is provably true that the set of real numbers is not countable. But because the model itself is countable from the outside, there exists an enumeration of its elements. This includes the real numbers in the model, even though the model itself says no such enumeration exists. Here's an example to make it more concrete. Suppose we build a model of ZF using only countable elements. In this model, there's a set that plays the role of the real numbers. We'll call it R star. The model satisfies the axiom that says R star is uncountable. In other words, there's no function inside the model that maps the natural numbers onto R star. So the model believes that R star is uncountable. But we, from the outside, can construct a mapping from the natural numbers to the elements of R star. That's because the model itself is countable. Every set in it can be labelled or listed using natural numbers. The paradox is that uncountable means different things depending on where you're standing. Skolem used this to argue that set theory, and formal systems more generally, cannot capture the full richness of mathematical meaning. He didn't think that this made mathematics inconsistent, but he did think it showed that formal theories had limits. In his view, the idea of a single, absolute set theoretic universe was misleading. There can be many models of set theory, each with its own view of which sets are countable or uncountable. No one model can claim to be the true one. This opens the door to model theoretic relativism. If different models of set theory have different properties, then mathematical truth depends on the model. One model might contain large cardinals, another might not. One might satisfy the continuum hypothesis, another might not. If you ask whether a certain set exists, the answer depends on which model you're in. This viewpoint runs against the intuition many mathematicians have, that mathematics describes a single, objective reality. Some logicians have tried to avoid this by using stronger logical systems. ZF is a first-order theory. In a stronger second-order version of set theory, you can pin down the concept of uncountability more tightly, but second-order logic comes with its own costs. It loses some of the completeness and compactness properties of first-order logic. It also becomes harder to handle in practice. Most formal systems used in logic and computer science stick with first-order logic for that reason. Skolem's paradox is also important in discussions of definability. Inside a countable model of ZF, the model may contain sets that are not definable from any formula within the model. That is, the model might contain objects that it cannot name. From the outside, we can describe every element, but from inside, many of those elements are invisible. This idea touches on themes in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, where some truths about arithmetic can't be proven within arithmetic. Skolem's paradox shows a similar kind of gap, not between truth and provability, but between internal and external perspectives on size and existence. What makes this paradox lastingly important is that it forces us to question what we mean by concepts like existence, uncountability, and even truth. In the everyday practice of mathematics, people take for granted that certain sets exist and behave in specific ways. But Skolem's result shows that those claims depend on the model you choose. A statement like, "There exists an uncountable set," can be both true in one model and false in another, without contradiction. That means truth in mathematics is not always absolute. It can be model relative. Skolem's paradox doesn't destroy set theory, but it shows that our ideas about infinity and size are more flexible and more fragile than they seem. The semantic paradox of vagueness arises when we try to use clear reasoning to analyze words and concepts that are inherently unclear. It shows up most famously in the Soreit's paradox, sometimes called the paradox of the heap. The problem centers on borderline cases, situations where a term applies neither clearly nor definitely fails to apply. These are common in natural language. We say someone is tall, but we can't say exactly how tall someone must be to qualify. We say a pile of sand is a heap, but we can't pinpoint the exact number of grains where it becomes one. When we try to build a sharp boundary for a vague term, we run into trouble. Start with a simple example. Suppose we say that 1 grain of sand does not make a heap. That feels safe. Now we assume that if 1 grain is not enough to make a heap, then adding just 1 more grain won't suddenly make it a heap either. If we keep applying this rule, we'll end up concluding that even 1,000,000 grains of sand don't make a heap. That's obviously wrong. We know a huge pile is a heap, but our reasoning pushed us from a safe premise to an absurd conclusion. Somewhere along the way, the reasoning must have failed, but it's not clear where. This is the paradox. If a concept like heap has no sharp boundary, then how can we reason about it precisely? If the boundary exists, then why can't we find it? If the boundary doesn't exist, then why do we still act as though some things clearly are heaps and others clearly aren't? The issue here is not just about sand or language, it's about how meaning works in everyday thought and how logic handles categories that don't have firm edges. One reaction is to try to find the hidden cutoff. Maybe there's a secret threshold where the number of grains switches the object from not a heap to heap. That's called an epistemic approach. It says the concept is exact, but we don't know where the dividing line is. According to this view, every vague term hides a sharp truth. We just can't access it. It's like a mystery with a real solution, even if no one knows it. The problem with this view is that it goes against the way we actually use language. We don't treat vague terms like that. We adjust them based on context. The boundary shifts depending on what we're comparing, what we expect, and what's typical. That makes the epistemic view feel unnatural. Another response is to deny that vague terms ever need sharp boundaries. This leads to degrees of truth. In this view, a statement like "this is a heap" isn't just true or false, it can be partly true. Maybe it's 80% true or 60% true. This approach uses many-valued logic, which replaces classical two-valued logic with a spectrum. It handles vagueness by softening the edges of truth. The idea comes from fuzzy logic, a system developed in the 20th century. In fuzzy logic, categories have graded membership. An object might belong to the category of tall people to a degree of 0.7, rather than fully or not at all. This view aligns better with how people talk. We often speak in shades rather than absolutes. We say someone is sort of tall or pretty old. These phrases reflect the idea of partial truth. But this approach also brings its own problems. It's not always clear what these percentages mean. Is 70% tall a meaningful value or just a placeholder? And what happens when we combine many vague terms? If each term is partly true, does the combination obey the rules of logic? Should we redefine logical connectives like and, or, and not to fit these degrees? These questions show that moving from binary to fuzzy logic changes more than just our handling of terms. It reshapes the whole logical structure. Another strategy is to give up on truth values altogether and focus on how words function. This is the pragmatic approach. It says that vagueness is a feature of how people use language in real situations. There is no deep semantic rule that determines when a term applies. Instead, speakers negotiate meaning on the fly. This approach is common in fields like linguistics and cognitive science. It treats categories like heap or bald as flexible, evolving, and context-sensitive. This avoids the need for paradox-resolving rules, but it comes at a cost. It makes logic harder to formalize. If truth depends on shifting use, then reasoning becomes a social process, not a fixed system. Each response reflects a different view of language. The epistemic view sees vagueness as an illusion, a sign of ignorance. The degrees of truth view sees vagueness as real but manageable by extending logic. The pragmatic view sees vagueness as normal and unavoidable. Each tries to preserve some aspect of how we talk, while solving the logical problem. But none is perfect. That's what makes the paradox enduring. We can find similar problems in real life. Take legal reasoning. A law might say that a person must be of sound mind to sign a contract. That's a vague phrase. It doesn't give a checklist or a score. Judges and lawyers interpret it case by case. There's no fixed boundary between sound and unsound mind. Yet the law must draw lines. At some point, a person either can or can't sign a contract. The court must decide. But that decision often involves vague concepts being forced into sharp outcomes. Another example is medical diagnosis. Terms like obese or hypertensive are defined by thresholds, like body mass index or blood pressure readings. but those thresholds are arbitrary. A person with a BMI of 29.9 is labelled overweight. A person with a BMI of 30.0 is labelled obese. 1 decimal point changes the category, but there's no dramatic difference in health between the two. The labels are convenient for communication, but they mask the vagueness in the underlying condition. The body doesn't flip from healthy to unhealthy at a magic number. This is the vagueness problem applied to science and policy. Even in artificial intelligence, the paradox shows up. Language models and classifiers often must label data. A photo is tagged as a cat, or not cat, but some images are ambiguous. They might be blurry, or the cat might be half hidden. The system must still choose. The computer mimics sharp boundaries, but the training data may contain edge cases. Designers must decide how to handle borderline inputs. These decisions often expose the same vagueness that human language struggles with. The paradox of vagueness also challenges how we think about identity and persistence. Consider the question: when does a person become old? At age 60, 65, 70? There's no fixed answer. People age differently. Culture shapes what counts as old. But we still use the word and build systems around it. Retirement policies, senior discounts, healthcare plans. Each system must define the term, even though the definition can't be exact. That's the paradox. We rely on vague concepts to make sharp decisions. One way to respond is to admit that some boundaries are conventional. They're drawn not because they reflect deep truths, but because they help us function. A law, a policy, or a system needs rules. But those rules are not discoveries about the world. They're agreements. That lets us live with vagueness without demanding that it disappear. But the paradox remains. It reminds us that much of what we take to be clear and rational rests on concepts that resist clear lines. The semantic paradox of vagueness forces us to confront the limits of logic in natural language. It reveals that not all reasoning fits into neat categories. It also shows that language, while powerful, carries imprecision at its core. When we use words like heap, tall, old, or rich, we enter a space where meaning is shaped by comparison, expectation, and use, not by fixed definitions. The paradox doesn't break logic, but it stretches it. It asks us to choose between clarity and realism, between precision and the messiness of human thought. Dr. Evil's clone paradox is a thought experiment that raises questions about identity, consciousness, and personal survival. The scenario is simple but unsettling. Imagine a mad scientist, Dr. Evil, who creates an exact physical copy of you. This clone has the same body, the same memories, the same thoughts and preferences. From the moment it's activated, it believes it is you. It even remembers waking up this morning, brushing your teeth, and thinking about the things only you think about. Then, Dr. Evil tells you, one of you will be destroyed. The other will walk out of the lab and continue life as normal. The problem is, which one is you? This paradox forces a confrontation with the question of what makes someone the same person over time. Is personal identity tied to the physical body? Is it the brain? Is it the continuity of memory or consciousness? When we imagine the clone waking up and behaving just like you, it becomes hard to say that you're uniquely tied to your current body. After all, the clone feels like you. It remembers being you. It acts like you. From the outside, no one can tell the difference. So why should you think that your consciousness would stay with one and not the other? The paradox becomes sharper if you consider what matters in survival. Suppose you care about living to see tomorrow. Dr. Evil says he will destroy one of you. The other will go free. If you're the original, should you fear death? Or does it not matter because your thoughts and memories will continue in someone else? Philosophers call this the problem of personal identity in cases of duplication. It asks whether survival is all or nothing, or whether it can be shared. If you think that your identity depends on your body, then you might say that the clone is just a copy. No matter how perfect, you are your body, and if your body dies, you die. That view aligns with a physicalist or biological approach. According to this view, your identity is tied to your unique physical continuity. The clone might act like you, but it's not you. It's a new person with your traits. Under this view, you would have every reason to fear being destroyed, because only your original body houses the real you. But this view has problems. Your body changes constantly. Cells die and regenerate. Memories fade. Personalities evolve. Yet we still say the person continues. So maybe identity isn't about matter, but about patterns. Patterns of thought, memory, behavior. If the clone carries those patterns, it might qualify as a continuation of you. This leads to the psychological continuity theory. According to it, what matters is not the body, but the uninterrupted chain of mental states. If someone remembers your past and thinks your thoughts, they might as well be you. This view handles change better. It allows for survival through transformation. But it creates a problem in duplication cases. If identity depends only on mental continuity, then both you and the clone have equal claim to being you. That's where the paradox bites. There's now one original and one copy, and both have your memories, your personality, and your sense of self. But they can't both be you, because they'll live separate lives. So which one is it? One possible response is to say that identity is not what matters. That's Derek Parfit's solution. He argues that personal identity is not what we care about. What matters is psychological continuity and connectedness. If someone exists tomorrow who thinks your thoughts and continues your projects, it doesn't matter if they're technically the same person. Identity is a label. Survival is a matter of degree. In the Dr. Evil scenario, Parfit would say that your clone preserves what matters, even if it's not strictly you. But this answer is emotionally hard to accept. Suppose you're told you'll be painlessly killed and the clone will go on living your life. Would you feel relief? Would you agree to it? Or would you still dread death, even though someone just like you will continue? The intuition that identity matters, not just continuity, is strong. We don't just want someone to live like us. We want to be the one who lives. The paradox also has implications for teleportation. Imagine a machine that scans your body, destroys it, and reassembles it somewhere else using new matter. Is the person who steps out the same person? Or a copy? The Dr. Evil Thought experiment is a version of that problem, but more vivid because both versions exist at once. If the teleportation machine made two versions of you, would either one be you? Both? Neither? Some try to solve the paradox by pointing to first-person experience. You are the one having this current experience, and no one else can have that. The clone has its own perspective, even if it matches yours. So identity lies in subjective continuity, the stream of consciousness that you feel right now. But this answer doesn't help with the decision. If Dr. Evil tells you that the clone will go free, not you, does that comfort you? Probably not. That suggests that subjective continuity matters, not just memory or behavior. The paradox also challenges how we think about death. If someone identical to you survives, do you survive? Does death occur when experience ends, or when patterns stop? Consider this. If you fell asleep and woke up as the clone with no knowledge of the swap, would you feel cheated? If not, why care about which version survives? But if yes, then some aspect of selfhood is being lost in the transition. In ethics, this matters too. If a person is duplicated and one is harmed, is that harm to the original person? Is the clone responsible for things the original did? If the clone commits a crime, can you be blamed? What if the clone inherits your debts or your family? These questions reveal how personal identity is not just a metaphysical issue. It underlies moral and legal reasoning. Dr. Evil's clone paradox highlights the limits of our concepts. It shows that the idea of a person is not as solid as we think. We treat personal identity as a simple thread through time, but when faced with perfect copies, the thread splits. Each path feels valid. Each one claims the full inheritance of yourself. That forces a decision. Do we accept that identity is fuzzy and survival comes in degrees? Or do we insist on a unique self, even if we can't explain what makes it unique? In the end, the paradox forces us to choose between competing intuitions. One says that identity is absolute. There is one you, and no copy can replace that. The other says that identity is a matter of functional continuity, memory, personality, goals. If the copy has those, then it doesn't matter who is destroyed. Both options are unsettling. Both stretch our idea of what it means to be a person. The thought experiment doesn't give a solution. It holds up a mirror and asks, if someone exactly like you lives on, is that enough? The paradox of the preface is a puzzle about belief, certainty, and how we handle contradictions in practice. It comes from something that happens often when someone writes a book, especially a non-fiction book like a history or science text. The author spends years researching, checking facts, and making sure everything is correct. Each statement in the book is something the author believes to be true. But then, in the preface, the author often adds a modest note. They expect that at least one statement in the book might turn out to be wrong. They invite the reader's corrections or understanding. That small remark, meant to be humble, becomes the source of the paradox. The problem is simple but deep. The author believes every individual claim in the book. They have evidence and reasons for each one. If asked, they would say, yes, this is true, page by page, but at the same time, they also believe that the book as a whole contains at least one mistake. That's because no long work ever avoids error, so they also believe that at least one statement in the book is false. This seems like a contradiction. The author believes each sentence is true, but also believes that not all the sentences are true. That combination feels inconsistent. This creates a tension between two reasonable principles. One is that if you believe a set of things, and each one seems well supported, then you can believe the whole set. The other is that if you know from experience that such sets often contain errors, then you should not believe that all the claims are true together. In this case, the author's beliefs are individually rational, but collectively conflicted. This paradox matters because it reflects a common feature of how people think. We often hold beliefs that are reasonable one by one, but problematic when taken together. For example, a scientist may believe the results of every experiment in a journal issue. Each study passed peer review and looks solid. But they might also believe that at least one of those studies has a flaw, simply because science is imperfect and errors happen. The same thing happens in legal trials, medical diagnoses, and even everyday conversations. One way to deal with the paradox is to separate belief from certainty. You can believe each claim in the book because it meets a certain standard of evidence, but still be open to the possibility that one or more are wrong. That doesn't mean you know any are wrong, it just means you're not certain they're all right. This is called fallibilism, the idea that beliefs can be reasonable even if they might turn out to be false. Under fallibilism, it makes sense for the author to believe each claim, and also to believe that some claim might be mistaken. The beliefs are not logically inconsistent if they are not held with absolute certainty. That is, the author believes each claim is probably true, but also that the set is unlikely to be completely flawless. This resolves the contradiction at the cost of giving up the idea that belief must be firm and fixed. It turns belief into something more like trust, confidence, or estimation. Another approach uses probability. The author can assign a high probability to each individual statement, say 99% confidence, but that still means the chance that all 1,000 statements are correct is less than 1. If the statements are independent, the probability that every one of them is true drops with each added claim, so it's reasonable to believe each statement on its own, while also believing that the total set probably includes an error. This avoids inconsistency by showing that beliefs don't have to add up in the way logic suggests. For example, if you believe each fact in a news report with high confidence, you might still doubt that the entire article is flawless. Typos happen. A source might be misquoted. Even a careful writer can make mistakes. So you expect some level of error without being able to point to a specific false claim. That's how the paradox of the preface works. It reflects the structure of everyday knowledge, strong confidence in parts, guarded caution about the whole. The paradox becomes more serious when applied to belief systems like religious doctrines, legal codes, or political ideologies. A person might believe each part of a doctrine based on trust, tradition, or study. But they might also think deep down that human systems are imperfect and that some part of their belief set might be wrong. This can create discomfort, cognitive dissonance, or doubt. The paradox shows that such tensions are not signs of failure. They are built into how belief works when applied across many claims. One reaction is to try to remove the paradox by reducing the belief set. The author might say, "I believe most of the claims, but I withhold belief about some parts." That avoids the contradiction, but it weakens the belief structure. It's like saying, "I'm not sure what I believe in this book," which undercuts the purpose of writing it. This reveals the cost of trying to avoid paradox by limiting belief. Another possible response is to say that belief is not always a binary state. Either you believe something or you don't. Instead, belief can be graded. You can believe something strongly, weakly, or conditionally. In this view, the author believes each statement to a degree and believes that some error exists overall with a higher degree of confidence. That approach allows for flexible belief systems, but it raises questions about how beliefs interact. Can you make decisions based on beliefs if they are not firm? Can you defend a claim if you only believe it 80%? The paradox of the preface also connects to a problem in epistemology called the lottery paradox. Suppose you buy a lottery ticket in a game with 1,000,000 tickets. You believe that any given ticket will not win. That's reasonable. Each has a tiny chance. But you also believe that one ticket will win. So you end up believing that ticket number 1 won't win, ticket number 2 won't win, and so on, up to ticket 1,000,000. Yet you also believe that one of them must win. That set of beliefs is inconsistent. Like the author of the preface, you believe each part of a set, and also believe that at least one part must be wrong. These paradoxes show that rational belief is not always logically tidy. Humans don't reason in perfect systems. We deal with uncertainty, error, and scale. When belief systems grow large, the risk of error increases even if each belief is well supported. The paradox of the preface makes that clear. It shows how rational confidence in each piece can coexist with rational doubt about the whole. The challenge is not to eliminate the tension, but to manage it responsibly. In practice, this means acknowledging fallibility while maintaining commitment. A historian might say, "I believe these facts, but I'm open to correction." A scientist might say, "I trust this theory, but I'll revise it if new evidence appears." A philosopher might say, "I hold this view, but I know I might be wrong." These attitudes reflect a mature stance toward knowledge. They don't weaken belief, they protect it from arrogance. The paradox of the preface is not about a mistake in reasoning. It's about the structure of belief under uncertainty. It shows that rational agents must sometimes hold beliefs that don't line up perfectly. Each belief might be well grounded, yet the whole set might not be free from error. This is not failure. It's how belief works when stretched across a complex world. The paradox teaches humility without undermining knowledge. McGee's paradox is a puzzle in logic that exposes a surprising conflict between common assumptions about truth, implication, and reasoning. It shows that if we accept certain natural principles, things we usually take for granted in ordinary and formal reasoning, we can end up proving a contradiction. The paradox was introduced by Van McGee in the 1980s. While it may not be as well known as the liar paradox or Curry's paradox, it raises deep concerns about how we treat the logical relationship between truth and implication, especially in formal systems like arithmetic and semantics. To understand McGee's paradox, we begin with a few basic principles. First is modus ponens. This is one of the most trusted rules in logic. It says that if P is true, and if P then Q is true, then Q must also be true. If we believe both the premise and the conditional, we should believe the conclusion. This rule seems undeniable. Second, we usually assume that the truth predicate, saying something like, "It is true that P," works in line with how logic behaves. If P is true, then we expect to be able to say, "It is true that P." We also assume that the truth predicate can be applied to sentences expressed in a formal language, such as arithmetic or a formal version of English. Now let's build the steps that lead to the paradox. Consider a long sequence of logical steps involving natural language and the truth predicate. Suppose we construct a sentence of this form. If this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. That sentence looks similar to a liar-type sentence, but McGee's version avoids self-reference. Instead, it involves an implication about an obviously false mathematical claim, such as 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. No one believes that 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, and any system of arithmetic would reject that claim. Now suppose you accept the following assumptions. If a sentence P is true and P implies Q, then Q is true. This is a mix of the truth predicate and modus ponens. You accept standard arithmetic, which says that 2 plus 2 does not equal 5. You accept that logical reasoning applies to sentences about truth the same way it applies to other sentences. McGee shows that with these assumptions, you can derive a contradiction in formal systems. He uses a trick that avoids circularity, but still manages to sneak in a paradoxical structure. Here's how the key structure works, simplified. First, define a sentence S that says, if this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. This is not circular in the traditional sense, it's an implication, but if we suppose that S is true, then what it says must be true. That is, if S is true, then 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. But 2 plus 2 is not equal to 5, so we must conclude that S is not true. That makes sense. But now here's the twist. Suppose instead of using just one sentence, we create a list of sentences S1, S2, S3, and so on. Each one says something like, Sen. If all previous Ci for I smaller than are true, then 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. Now suppose we say that all these sentences are true. That seems fine since each one only refers to earlier ones. There's no direct self-reference, but now you have a chain of conditionals. Each sentence says, if the earlier ones are true, then 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. But since 2 plus 2 does not equal 5, at least one of these conditionals must be false. So at least one of the sentences is not true. But now we ask, can you pinpoint which one is false? Each conditional seems valid. It's of the form, if A, then false. If A is true, then the conditional is false. If A is false, then the conditional is true. So if none of the antecedents is true, then the implication is fine. But if all the antecedents are true, then the implications lead to 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, which is false. That creates a pressure point. The logic seems to force one of the antecedents to be false. Now we return to modus ponens. If you accept each implication and also accept each antecedent, then the conclusion follows. If you accept the truth of each S sub n, and accept that if S sub n is true, then 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, then you are committed to accepting that 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, which is false. So to avoid that result, you must reject something. Here's the paradox. All the assumptions seem valid. Modus ponens is sound. Truth can be applied to sentences in a standard way. Basic arithmetic holds. Logical implication works the way it always has. But when you put them together in this structured way, you end up with a contradiction. That means at least one of your assumptions must be wrong. But which one? Some logicians say that modus ponens has to be weakened. That sounds extreme, but McGee's result forces the possibility. In certain formal systems, especially ones with a truth predicate, it may be necessary to restrict the use of modus ponens when applied to statements involving semantic content. Others say that the problem is not with modus ponens, but with how we use the truth predicate. They argue that we can't always substitute P as true for P in all contexts. That substitution works in many places, But in paradoxical settings, it creates instability. This view draws on the lessons of semantic paradoxes like the liar. If you treat P as true as just another sentence, it opens the door to hidden circularity. There's also a technical angle. In formal systems like piano arithmetic, adding a truth predicate creates problems. If you try to formalize truth inside the system, you run into Gödel-style limits. Tarski showed that you can't define a truth predicate for a language within that language without inconsistency. McGee's paradox doesn't rely on direct self-reference, but it still shows that even limited uses of a truth predicate can cause trouble. The paradox also raises questions about logical consequence. In classical logic, if P, then Q, is treated as false only when P is true and Q is false. But in natural language, conditionals are more subtle. The paradox exploits that ambiguity. By embedding false consequences in long chains of implication, it stretches the boundaries of logical rules. Consider an example in everyday reasoning. Suppose a newspaper editor writes, "If any part of this article is wrong, then aliens must have landed." The article is long and detailed. Each sentence seems accurate, but no one believes that alien landings depend on sentence-level accuracy. The conditional is used to express confidence, but formally it's bizarre. If someone shows a small error, the editor's statement implies something absurd. This shows how real-world use of implication differs from strict logic. McGee's paradox works in a similar way. It builds a structure where each step is acceptable, but the whole leads to a result no one accepts. The lesson is that logic, when extended to truth and language, must be handled carefully. Even rules that seem unbreakable can clash when applied in broad settings. The paradox doesn't destroy logic, but it pushes its limits. It shows that systems involving semantic concepts, like truth, must restrict how rules like modus ponens apply, or they must redefine what counts as implication. Either way, something has to give. This is what makes McGee's paradox important. It reveals a hidden fault line in formal reasoning. It doesn't use lies or self-reference. It just uses careful logical steps and a truth predicate, yet it still leads to contradiction. That's what makes it disturbing. It means that paradox can arise not from cheating the rules, but from following them. That insight forces logicians to rethink how even basic reasoning works when language and truth are involved. Simpson's paradox is a statistical phenomenon where a trend appears in several different groups of data, but disappears or reverses when the groups are combined. It shows how misleading it can be to interpret averages or percentages without considering how data is structured. The paradox highlights a flaw in human reasoning and data interpretation. Even when we calculate numbers correctly, we can draw the wrong conclusion if we ignore the context of the data. The classic example involves two treatments for a medical condition. Suppose you have data on two drugs, A and B. In both men and women separately, drug A has a higher success rate than drug B. But when you combine the data for men and women, drug B has a higher overall success rate. This seems impossible at first. How can a drug be better in each subgroup but worse overall? The answer lies in how the data is distributed. Suppose drug A was given mostly to very sick patients, while drug B was given mostly to healthier ones. The success rate of drug A might still be better within each severity level, but because more high-risk patients took drug A, its overall average drops. When the data is pooled without considering patient groups, the result is misleading. This is Simpson's paradox. Here's a concrete example with simple numbers. Imagine a university's admissions data. Suppose that in two departments, women have a higher acceptance rate than men. In Department X, 90 out of 100 women were admitted, 90%, and 80 out of 100 men were admitted, 80%. In Department Y, 30 out of 100 women were admitted, 30%, and 20 out of 100 men were admitted, 20%. In both departments, women have a higher success rate, but now suppose that 90% of the women applied to Department Y and only 10% applied to Department X. Meanwhile, 90% of the men applied to Department X and only 10% to Department Y. This gives women. 90 women apply to Department Y implies 30% accepted means 27 admitted. 10 women apply to Department X implies 90% accepted means 9 admitted. Total women, 100 applicants, 36 admitted means 36%. Men, 90 men apply to Department X implies 80% accepted means 72 admitted. 10 men apply to Department Y implies 20% accepted means 2 admitted. Total men, 100 applicants, 74 admitted means 74%. Now the overall result shows men with a 74% acceptance rate and women with 36%, even though women had higher success in both departments. The paradox appears because the distribution of applicants affects the aggregate rate. Women mostly applied to the harder department, men mostly applied to the easier one. If you ignore that, the numbers tell a false story. Simpson's paradox is not a flaw in the data, it's a flaw in how we interpret the data without understanding how categories influence outcomes. The paradox reveals that conclusions based on summary statistics can be reversed when the data is split into more detailed subgroups. This happens often in real-world scenarios. In criminal justice, suppose a certain policy seems to reduce crime in every neighbourhood, but crime goes up city-wide. That can happen if the population shifted. If more people moved into high-crime areas, the total crime number rises even though crime fell within each area. In business, a new sales strategy might improve performance in each product line, but overall revenue drops because more effort was put into a low-margin product. In healthcare, one drug might perform better for each age group, but worse overall because it was given to a group with more complications. Simpson's paradox also affects scientific studies. Consider a clinical trial comparing 2 treatments across different age groups. Treatment A may outperform treatment B in both younger and older patients, but if most older patients, who tend to respond less well overall, receive treatment A, the total success rate for A may drop. If we look only at the aggregate data, we might wrongly choose the inferior treatment. The key idea behind the paradox is that averages are sensitive to the sizes and properties of the groups being combined. This is especially true when the variable of interest is connected to the way the data is grouped. Statisticians call this a case of a confounding variable. A confounder is something that influences both the independent and dependent variables, creating a misleading association. In the university example, the department applied to is a confounder. It affects both gender and acceptance rate. If you ignore it, you get a distorted picture of gender bias. This was the real-life context of a famous case in the 1970s, when UC Berkeley was accused of gender discrimination. The overall data showed men had a higher admission rate, but when researchers examined individual departments, they found that women were more likely to apply to competitive departments with lower admission rates. Within departments, women were often admitted at equal or higher rates than men. The conclusion changed once the confounder, department choice, was considered. Simpson's paradox reminds us that we must be careful with data summaries. Comparing totals or averages can hide the structure underneath. To make sound conclusions, we must ask whether other variables are influencing the outcome. If they are, we must analyze subgroups or adjust the data to account for them. Ignoring structure leads to bad decisions, even when the math is right. This paradox also plays a role in machine learning and AI. Algorithms trained on historical data might pick up patterns that are artifacts of aggregation. For example, an AI that predicts job performance may learn that certain demographics perform better on average. But if those averages hide group differences, the algorithm can reinforce existing biases. Engineers must be careful to separate true causal relationships from statistical illusions. Simpson's paradox shows that the relationship between data and truth is not always direct. Numbers can reflect real effects, but also hide them. Understanding the context, structure, and causal links in the data is essential. Statistical literacy requires more than computing percentages. It means knowing when averages lie, how grouping affects results, and how to spot misleading trends. This paradox challenges the assumption that more data always brings more clarity. In fact, it warns that combining data without understanding it can lead to confusion. It also calls for humility in analysis. Strong conclusions demand more than clean calculations. They require thoughtful modelling and careful interpretation. The paradox is not a rare curiosity. It's a reminder that behind every number is a structure, and behind every structure is a choice about how to see the world. The paradox of voting, also known as the Condorcet paradox, shows that even when individual voters have clear and rational preferences, the outcome of a group decision can be inconsistent or irrational. This creates a deep problem for democratic theory. If a group of people votes to express what the majority wants, we expect the result to make sense. But the Condorcet paradox shows that majority rule can lead to cycles, contradictions, and no clear winner. It reveals that collective choice can fail to reflect any coherent group preference, even when every voter is perfectly rational. The paradox is named after the 18th century French mathematician and philosopher Marquis de Condorcet. He was interested in how democratic voting systems could be designed to express the will of the people. He proposed that in any fair election, if one candidate would beat every other candidate in a one-on-one contest, then that candidate should win. This idea is called the Condorcet winner. It seems reasonable. If most people prefer candidate A over B, and also prefer A over C, then A should win. But Condorcet discovered that sometimes no such candidate exists. To see how the paradox works, consider a simple election with three candidates, A, B, and C. Suppose there are three voters with the following preferences. Voter 1 prefers candidate A over candidate B, and candidate B over candidate C. Voter 2 prefers candidate B over candidate C, and candidate C over candidate A. Voter 3 prefers candidate C over candidate A, and candidate A over candidate B. Now compare each pair of candidates using majority rule. First, compare candidate A to candidate B. Voter 1 prefers A over B. Voter 2 prefers B over A. Voter 3 prefers A over B. So candidate A is preferred over candidate B by 2 votes to 1. Next, compare candidate B to candidate C. Voter 1 prefers B over C. Voter 2 prefers B over C. Voter 3 prefers C over B. So candidate B is preferred over candidate C by 2 votes to 1. Now compare candidate C to candidate A. Voter 1 prefers A over C. Voter 2 prefers C over A. Voter 3 prefers C over A. So candidate C is preferred over candidate A by 2 votes to 1. Now we have a cycle. Candidate A is preferred over candidate B. Candidate B is preferred over candidate C. Candidate C is preferred over candidate A. This forms a loop where majority preference violates logical order. The group prefers A over B, B over C, and C over A, which is circular and inconsistent. This illustrates the core of the Condorcet paradox. Each individual voter has consistent preferences, no one is confused, but the group preference is not consistent. This is the paradox. Majority rule, which seems like a fair way to make group decisions, can produce results that don't make sense. This problem is not just theoretical. It can show up in real elections, committee votes, and any situation where people have to rank multiple options. It can appear with any odd number of voters and any 3 or more options. As the number of voters and choices increases, the chances of encountering such cycles also increase. The paradox doesn't require strange or irrational voters. It comes from the structure of majority rule itself. One way to understand the paradox is to see that majority preferences don't always form a clear order. Instead, they can form loops or cycles. In mathematics, this is called a non-transitive relation. It's like saying a rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and paper beats rock. That's fine in a game. But in voting, it creates a problem. The group preference depends not just on what people want, but also on how the choices are compared. That opens the door to strategic manipulation. If there is no clear winner, then whoever sets the agenda, deciding which options to compare first, can influence the outcome. Suppose you vote in a legislature where motions are decided pairwise. If the agenda starts with A versus B and A wins, then A faces C. But if the agenda starts with B versus C and B wins, then B faces A. Each path can lead to a different result. That means the final outcome can be shaped not by what voters want, but by the order of decisions. This undermines the fairness of the process. The paradox also affects how we design voting systems. Many countries use systems like plurality rule, whoever gets the most votes wins, runoff voting, top two advance, or ranked choice voting, voters rank candidates, and the least popular are eliminated in rounds. None of these systems always avoids the Condorcet cycle. Each can pick a winner who would lose in a head-to-head match against another candidate. That means they can fail to select the Condorcet winner even when one exists. Some systems try to fix this. The Condorcet method is a class of voting systems that always picks the Condorcet winner if one exists. These methods look at all possible head-to-head matchups and declare the candidate who beats all others as the winner. But if there's a cycle, the system must break the tie. Different versions use different tiebreakers. Some choose the candidate with the smallest margin of loss. Others use a scoring system to find the candidate with the strongest overall performance. No voting system is perfect. Arrow's impossibility theorem, proven by economist Kenneth Arrow, shows that no system can satisfy all the conditions we want: unrestricted preferences, independence of irrelevant alternatives, non-dictatorship and transitivity. The Condorcet paradox is one reason for this result. It shows that collective preferences can violate transitivity, even when individuals are rational. This has real-world effects. In political elections with more than two candidates, vote splitting and strategic voting can distort the result. Voters might avoid ranking their favourite first if they think that choice can't win. They might vote for a compromise to block someone they dislike. The paradox creates a space for such manipulation. It also appears in group decisions beyond politics. In hiring, 3 interviewers might each prefer a different candidate. No single candidate wins a clear majority. In market research, customers may rank products differently, and aggregate preferences can form loops. In committee decisions, cycles can paralyze action or allow strategic control by whoever manages the vote. The paradox forces us to ask whether majority rule always gives a fair result. It also challenges the idea that democracy is simply a matter of counting preferences. If counting leads to cycles, then something deeper must guide decisions. Some theorists argue that deliberation, compromise and reasoning must supplement voting. Others focus on designing systems that reduce cycles or handle them transparently. The Condorcet paradox reveals that fairness in voting is more complicated than it seems. It shows that rational voters can still produce irrational outcomes. It challenges the belief that there is always a best choice in a group. And it warns that without careful design, democratic systems can fail to reflect the will of the people, not because voters are flawed, but because majority rule itself can fold in on itself. Goodstein's paradox is a strange and powerful result in mathematical logic. It begins with a simple process involving numbers and ends with a surprising conclusion that challenges our understanding of what can be proven in mathematics. At its core, the paradox shows that certain truths about natural numbers cannot be proven using standard arithmetic, even though they are clearly true. It highlights the limits of formal systems like piano arithmetic and shows how something that appears to grow rapidly beyond control can eventually collapse completely. The process begins with what is called hereditary base notation. Every natural number can be written in base 2 or base 3 or base 10. But in hereditary base notation, you go one step further. Not only do you write the number in base form, you also express all the exponents in base form. For example, take the number 16. In base 2, that's 2 to the power of 4. But in hereditary base 2 notation, The exponent 4 is itself written as 2 to the power of 2. So 16 becomes 2 to the power of 2 to the power of 2. For larger numbers, this structure builds up fast. It turns numbers into expressions filled with towers of exponents. Goodstein sequences start with a number written in hereditary base notation. You then perform 2 steps. First, you bump the base up by 1. If the base is 2, you change it to base 3. You do this not by recalculating the value in base 3, but by changing the symbol. So where the number used to be written using powers of 2, you now write it using powers of 3 in the same pattern. The second step is to subtract 1 from the new number. That gives the next number in the sequence. You repeat this process again and again. Increase the base, rewrite the number, subtract 1. What's remarkable is what happens next. The numbers in the sequence get very large very fast. At first they explode. Each base bump stretches the number into a taller tower. The subtractions feel minor. You might expect the sequence to grow forever, but it doesn't. No matter which number you start with, the sequence eventually drops to 0. Even if it goes up for hundreds or thousands of steps, it always comes down. This behaviour feels paradoxical. You see a pattern that gets larger with every step, yet somehow it always runs out. This result was proved by the British mathematician Reuben Goodstein in the 1940s. He showed that every Goodstein sequence eventually reaches 0. The proof uses transfinite ordinals, an extension of counting beyond the finite developed by Georg Cantor. Goodstein mapped each number in the sequence to a corresponding ordinal using a clever conversion. While the numbers explode in size, the corresponding ordinals go down. The ordinals move in a strictly decreasing pattern, and since ordinals cannot descend forever without reaching 0, the original sequence must eventually reach 0 too. Here is where the paradox appears. The fact that every Goodstein sequence ends at 0 is true. It has been proved using the rules of ordinal arithmetic. But you cannot prove it within Peano arithmetic, the standard system used to reason about natural numbers. That's the strange part. You can see it's true. You can prove it with transfinite logic. But Peano arithmetic, which handles addition, multiplication and induction, cannot establish it. This shows that some truths about numbers lie beyond what basic arithmetic can express. This limitation echoes the lesson of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Gödel showed that any consistent formal system powerful enough to express arithmetic will contain true statements that it cannot prove. Goodstein's paradox provides a concrete example of such a statement. It deals only with natural numbers. It uses nothing exotic. Yet proving it requires stepping outside the system. This has deep implications. Peano arithmetic is the foundation of many parts of mathematics. If it cannot prove something as simple-looking as the convergence of a Goodstein sequence, then we must accept that formal systems have limits. The paradox shows that our intuitive understanding of numbers reaches farther than our formal tools. To see the behaviour in action, you can start with small numbers. For example, take 4. In base 2, 4 is 2 squared. In hereditary notation, this is already simple. Now bump the base to 3. Write the same structure, but using base 3 instead of base 2. Subtract 1. You now have a new number, still structured as a tower. Repeat the process. Increase the base to 4. Rewrite. Subtract. At first, these steps look harmless. But with each base increase, the internal structure grows in complexity. After a few steps, the numbers become enormous. But surprisingly, after enough iterations, the values start to decrease. Eventually you arrive at 0. The early stages are easy to follow, but once you start with larger numbers like 16 or 30, the sequence becomes difficult to track. The tower of exponents grows so large that even the fastest computers can't keep up. Yet the proof says that no matter how wild it gets, it must come down. This is not an intuitive result. Nothing in the early behaviour of the sequence suggests a fall. That's what makes it paradoxical. Goodstein's paradox is also important in the study of proof theory and mathematical foundations. It shows that the truth of a statement can be confirmed from one viewpoint, and remain unreachable from another. In this case, transfinite methods confirm the truth, but piano arithmetic cannot reach it. This forces a choice. Do we expand our logical systems to include new principles like transfinite induction, or do we accept that our current tools are incomplete? Some mathematicians advocate for stronger systems like second-order arithmetic or set theory, which can capture these truths. Others argue that we must be careful about what kinds of objects we allow into our systems. The ordinals used in Goodstein's proof are not part of basic number theory. They involve a leap into the infinite. Some believe this leap is justified, others see it as too abstract. Either way, the paradox remains a challenge. It blurs the line between what we can see to be true and what we can prove. It shows that logic is not just about following rules, it's also about choosing which rules to accept. The behaviour of Goodstein sequences is a reminder that mathematics often involves surprises. Patterns can deceive, size can mislead, and even the most basic objects, natural numbers, can behave in ways that defy our formal expectations. Goodstein's paradox does not rely on illusions or tricks. It is rooted in ordinary arithmetic, but it grows out of a simple idea into a result that pushes the boundaries of logic. It forces us to ask whether we truly understand the numbers we use every day, and it shows that behind the familiar there are layers of complexity that go far beyond what intuition can reach. The Sleeping Beauty Paradox is a thought experiment in probability theory that raises deep questions about belief, information, and self-locating uncertainty. It begins with a simple story. A subject named Sleeping Beauty agrees to take part in a study. On Sunday, researchers tell her the setup. She will be put to sleep and a fair coin will be tossed. If the coin lands heads, she will be woken up on Monday, interviewed, then put back to sleep and the experiment will end. If the coin lands tails, she will be woken up on Monday, interviewed, put back to sleep with memory erased, and then woken up again on Tuesday and interviewed again. In both cases, she will not remember any previous awakening. When she wakes up in the experiment, she will not know which day it is or whether she has been woken before. Now the key question. When Sleeping Beauty wakes up, what should her degree of belief be that the coin landed heads? At first glance, the answer seems simple. The coin is fair, with equal chance of heads or tails. So she might think, the chance of heads is 1/2. But others argue that this is wrong. When she wakes up, the fact that she's awake gives her new information. Under heads, she would be woken once. Under tails, she would be woken twice. So it is twice as likely she wakes up under tails than heads. Some argue her belief should be 1/3 for heads and 2/3 for tails. This disagreement has sparked a long-running debate in philosophy, mathematics, and cognitive science. To understand both sides, it helps to compare the reasoning. The first group, known as Halfers, argue that the original chance of the coin is all that matters. Sleeping Beauty knows in advance that the coin is fair. Nothing she learns when she wakes up changes that. She expected to be woken regardless of the coin. Her memory is erased, so she gains no new evidence about the outcome. If you toss a fair coin, the chance of heads stays at 1/2, even if the outcome affects how many times you're woken. In this view, the experiment adds confusion, not knowledge. The second group, known as thirders, argue differently. They say that the act of waking up provides evidence. Suppose the experiment is repeated many times. Every time the coin lands heads, there is 1 awakening. Every time it lands tails, there are 2. Out of 3 awakenings, on average, 1 corresponds to heads and 2 to tails. So if you wake up without knowing which trial or which day it is, your chance of being in a heads awakening is 1 out of 3. In this view, belief should match the frequency of experiences, not just the coin's chance. The third view relies on self-locating uncertainty. When Sleeping Beauty wakes up, she is uncertain not only about the coin, but also about her position in time. She does not know whether it is Monday or Tuesday. This kind of uncertainty is called indexical uncertainty, uncertainty about where or when you are. It affects how you interpret probabilities. The Thrider says that you must consider the total number of indistinguishable wake-ups that could occur. Since there are 2 under tails and 1 under heads, waking up is more likely if the coin landed tails. To see how this works, imagine the experiment being run 1,000 times. If the coin lands heads in 500 cases, there are 500 total awakenings on Monday. If it lands tails in the other 500, there are 1,000 awakenings, both Monday and Tuesday. That makes a total of 1,500 awakenings. 1/3 happen under heads, 2/3 happen under tails. So from the perspective of a randomly chosen awakening, tails is twice as likely. The Thirder argues that since Sleeping Beauty has no way to distinguish which awakening she is in, her belief should match this ratio. The Halfer sees this as flawed. They argue that probability should track the coin, not the number of times the subject is questioned. From the Halfer's view, the fact that the subject is interviewed more under tails does not change the basic uncertainty about the coin. If the coin is fair, it stays fair. If Sleeping Beauty is asked, "What do you believe the chance of heads was before the experiment started?" she should still say 1/2. Her amnesia does not add new evidence. It only hides details she already expected to lose. In this view, updating beliefs requires real evidence, not just changes in perspective. But the Thirder replies that this is not about the coin alone. It's about how to assign belief when outcomes are connected to experiences. If being awake is more likely under tails, then waking up gives you reason to adjust your belief. This is similar to what happens in anthropic reasoning, where your existence gives you evidence about the world. If most possible observers would see something, and you see it too, then it's more likely that the world is the kind that allows such observers. In the Sleeping Beauty case, the experience of waking up is evidence, because it is more likely under one outcome. The paradox becomes sharper when you add betting. Suppose Sleeping Beauty is offered a bet each time she wakes. She can bet $1 on heads, and will win $2 if she is right. If the coin lands heads, she is woken once and wins $2. If it lands tails, she's woken twice, bets twice, and loses both times. So she loses $2. Her expected value is negative if she believes the chance of heads is 1/2. But if she uses the Thirder belief, 1/3 for heads and 2/3 for tails, her expected value is 0. That seems fair. So the betting outcome supports the Thirder view. The paradox touches on how to treat repeated evidence, memory loss, and subjective experience. It relates to questions about identity over time, Bayesian reasoning, and how agents should update beliefs. Philosophers compare it to other problems like the Monty Hall problem or the doomsday argument. Each of these involves strange updates to belief when you learn something indirectly, or when your knowledge is limited by your situation. There are also variations of the experiment. What if you wake up 3 times under tails? What if you're told the day? Each version changes how the information works, but the core issue stays the same. What happens to belief when the structure of the experiment limits what you know about your own situation? The Sleeping Beauty paradox does not have a single agreed answer. Many smart people defend each side. Some say the problem shows that belief must account for evidence of experiences. Others say it shows that formal reasoning must avoid confusing different kinds of uncertainty. Either way, the paradox reveals how subtle and complex the idea of belief really is. It shows that even simple setups can lead to deep puzzles when belief, time, and identity mix. It forces us to ask not only what we know, but also what it means to be uncertain about where or when we are. Jourdain's card. Paradox is a self-referential puzzle that highlights the strange things that happen when language refers to itself. It shows that even a simple statement can lead to contradiction when it involves circular reference and truth. The paradox was proposed in the early 20th century by English logician Philip Jourdain. It resembles the liar paradox, but with a twist. Instead of one sentence contradicting itself, Jourdain's version uses 2 sides of a card. Each side refers to the truth of the other side. When you try to decide which one is true, you end up in an endless loop. Imagine a card. On one side is written, "The statement on the other side of this card is true." On the other side is written, "The statement on the other side of this card is false." Now you are holding this card and reading both statements. The first statement says that the second statement is true. The second statement says that the first statement is false. The problem is to decide which statement is true and which is false. At first, you might try to take one side at face value. Suppose you assume that the first statement is true. That would mean the statement on the other side, the second statement, is true. But the second statement says that the first one is false. So if it is true, then the first statement must be false. That contradicts the assumption. Try the opposite. Suppose the first statement is false, then the statement on the other side is not true, it must be false. But the second statement says that the first statement is false. So if it is false, then the first statement is not false, it must be true. Again, contradiction. No matter which way you go, you end up trapped. You cannot assign a consistent truth value to both statements. If one is true, the other must be false. But that forces the first one to be both true and false at once. The loop makes it impossible to resolve. This is what makes it a paradox. It is not a matter of confusing language or bad grammar. The structure of the statements creates the problem. The two sentences are each simple on their own. But when combined in this exact form, they cancel each other out. They form a closed loop of reference that resists resolution. This kind of paradox raises questions about the limits of truth and reference. In everyday language, we often refer to other statements. We say things like, "What he said is true," or "Don't believe that report, it's false." These are usually fine, but when the reference becomes circular, logic starts to break down. Jourdain's card shows that even two simple sentences, if constructed carefully, can create a contradiction. This is related to the more famous liar paradox. That paradox is usually stated as, "This sentence is false. If it is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true." It seems to have no stable truth value. Jourdain's card version spreads the paradox across two statements. This avoids direct self-reference, but the effect is the same. The circular loop causes a breakdown in the system. The paradox has implications in formal logic and the philosophy of language. It suggests that certain systems of language can express things that cannot be consistently interpreted. When a system allows sentences to talk about the truth of other sentences within the same system, paradox becomes possible. This was part of the motivation behind work by Alfred Tarski in the 1930s, who tried to build a theory of truth that avoids these problems. Tarski showed that to avoid paradox, a language cannot contain its own truth predicate. That means you cannot safely talk about the truth of sentences from inside the same language. You need a higher level language to talk about the truth of the lower level one. Jourdain's card makes this clear in a visual and intuitive way. You hold the card, read one side, then flip to the other, then back again. Each side seems to make sense by itself, but together they trap you. This makes the paradox powerful as a teaching tool. It shows how language, when it turns back on itself, can create logical instability. There are other similar paradoxes in logic and mathematics. Russell's paradox is another famous one. It asks whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself. If it does, then it shouldn't. If it doesn't, then it should. Again, the loop collapses. In computer science, similar problems arise with programs that check other programs. Can a program tell whether it will halt or run forever? Turing showed that no such general solution exists. That proof also involves self-reference and contradiction. In formal logic, paradoxes like Jourdain's card are a warning. They show that not all expressions are safe to include in a system. To build a consistent theory, you must limit what kinds of statements can be made. This is why modern logical systems often use hierarchies. Statements in one level can't refer to the truth of statements at the same level. This avoids the loop that causes the contradiction. But in natural language, we don't always follow these strict rules. People use self-reference all the time. We say, everything I say is false, or ignore what I just said. In most cases, these are rhetorical, but when taken literally, they can break down. Jourdain's card is a simple reminder of that fact. Even without complex logical symbols, just 2 sentences can cause deep confusion. The paradox also raises questions about meaning. If a statement cannot be assigned a truth value, does it still mean something? Is it meaningless, or does it express a kind of truth that logic cannot handle? Some philosophers argue that paradoxical statements show that our concept of truth needs revision. Others argue that such statements are simply malformed, they break the rules of language and should be excluded. There is also a psychological aspect. When people encounter Jourdain's card for the first time, they often try to resolve it. They flip the card back and forth, hoping to find a stable answer. This reflects a natural desire for consistency. Our minds are trained to expect that statements have meaning, and that meaning includes truth or falsehood. When that expectation is frustrated, it creates discomfort. That discomfort is what makes the paradox memorable. Some thinkers have tried to escape the paradox by rejecting classical logic. In classical logic, every statement is either true or false. But maybe there is a third value, neither true nor false. This leads to non-classical logics, such as 3-valued logic or paraconsistent logic. In these systems, contradictions do not destroy the system. They are allowed in a controlled way. This lets us talk about paradoxes without collapsing the structure of reasoning. Jourdain's card paradox sits at the crossroads of language, logic, and thought. It shows that truth is not always as simple as we think. It warns that some questions do not have stable answers, and it invites us to think more deeply about how statements, meaning, and reference interact. It's a paradox made from ordinary sentences, but it opens the door to extraordinary problems. The Dutch book Paradox is a problem in decision theory and probability that reveals what happens when someone's beliefs are internally inconsistent. It shows that if a person assigns probabilities to outcomes in a way that violates the rules of probability, then a clever bettor could exploit those beliefs to guarantee a loss for that person, no matter what happens in the real world. The paradox gets its name from a kind of trap known to gamblers. A Dutch book is a set of bets that ensures a loss for one party, win or lose. The paradox suggests that irrational or incoherent beliefs can make someone vulnerable in this way. To see how the paradox works, imagine a simple case involving a coin toss. A fair coin has 2 outcomes, heads or tails. A rational person should assign each outcome a probability of 1/2. If someone instead says the chance of heads is 60% and tails is also 60%, then their beliefs add up to 1.2, which violates the basic rule that probabilities of all mutually exclusive outcomes must add up to 1. Now suppose a bookmaker notices this and offers bets accordingly. The bookmaker offers to sell the person a $1 bet on heads at a cost of 60 cents. If heads comes up, the bettor wins $1. If tails comes up, they lose their 60 cents. The bettor accepts this bet, thinking it's fair, since they believe heads has a 60% chance. Then the bookmaker sells them a $1 bet on tails, also for 60 cents. Again, the bettor accepts, since they also believe tails has a 60% chance. Now they have paid a total of $1.20, but only one of the 2 bets can win, since the coin can only land one way. They will get $1 back, but they've paid $1.20. They lose 20 cents no matter what happens. The bookmaker has made a Dutch book against them. This kind of guaranteed loss exposes the cost of incoherent beliefs. It doesn't depend on bad luck. It follows purely from inconsistent probabilities. If you believe too strongly in mutually exclusive outcomes, you create a situation where you can be manipulated into losing money, even in a fair world. The paradox is not about the fairness of the coin, but the structure of your beliefs. The logic of the Dutch book shows that if you want to avoid being trapped like this, your beliefs must obey the formal rules of probability. The Dutch book Paradox supports the idea that rational belief should be coherent. In formal terms, that means your degrees of belief should follow the probability axioms. Each belief should be a number between 0 and 1. the belief in a certain truth should be one, and the beliefs in mutually exclusive outcomes should add up to the belief in their union. If you break any of these rules, you open yourself up to a Dutch book. That makes these rules not just abstract constraints but practical necessities. This connection between coherence and rationality is one reason why subjective probability, or Bayesian epistemology, treats personal belief in terms of betting behaviour. If you say you believe something to degree X, that's taken to mean you would be willing to accept a bet at odds based on X. The Dutch book argument formalises this idea. If your beliefs can be translated into betting odds that produce a guaranteed loss, then your beliefs are not rational, even if they feel reasonable to you. Consider another case. Suppose someone believes that the chance of rain tomorrow is 70%. That means they should be willing to pay up to 70 cents for a $1 bet that it will rain, and should accept 70 cents to take the opposite side, that it won't rain. But if they assign inconsistent beliefs to other outcomes connected to rain, like whether the sky will be cloudy or whether they'll carry an umbrella, they can again be caught in a series of bets that guarantees a loss. The paradox also applies in more complex systems, like belief networks or decision trees. If your beliefs about several connected outcomes fail to add up properly, then a Dutch book can be constructed across multiple bets. Even when no single bet looks dangerous, the combination of them ensures a loss. This has implications for financial markets, insurance, and any system where risk is managed using probabilities. A trader who makes inconsistent assumptions can be arbitraged, taken advantage of by others who spot the imbalance. In practice, most people don't think in perfect probabilities. They estimate, guess, or rely on intuition. The Dutch book argument doesn't require perfect accuracy. It just says that if your estimates are structurally flawed, if they contradict each other in a specific way, then you are vulnerable. You don't need a clever bookmaker to find you. The incoherence can show up in bad decisions, missed opportunities, or conflicting expectations. Philosophers have debated whether the Dutch book argument proves that people should obey the laws of probability, or whether it only shows what happens if they don't. Some say it provides a normative foundation for rational belief. To be rational is to avoid guaranteed losses. Others say it only gives a practical warning. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It just tells you what happens if your beliefs clash in certain ways. There are also objections. Some critics point out that real people don't always bet based on their beliefs. They might refuse a bet for other reasons: risk aversion, ethical concerns, or emotional factors. The Dutch book argument assumes that beliefs translate directly into betting behaviour, which is often not true. Others argue that the connection between belief and betting is too narrow. You might believe something strongly without wanting to bet on it, especially if the stakes are unclear. Still, the Dutch book paradox remains a powerful idea. It links rational thought with practical consequence. It shows that beliefs are not just private feelings, they have structure, and that structure can be tested. If your beliefs can be used against you in a bet, then they are not just mistaken, they are incoherent. And if you want to make good decisions in uncertain situations, you must avoid that incoherence. The paradox also helps explain why probability theory is not just about numbers. It's a model of rational belief. It tells you how to keep your beliefs in balance, how to combine them, and how to update them when new information arrives. Bayesian reasoning in particular is built on this foundation. It treats belief as a fluid system that must remain internally consistent. When new evidence appears, you revise your beliefs using Bayes' rule. If you don't, you risk inconsistency and a Dutch book. In gambling, business, and science, the stakes are real. In everyday life, the risks may be less obvious, but the principle holds. Beliefs must add up. You can't believe in too many things too strongly. If you do, you're not just confused, you're setting yourself up for loss. The Dutch book paradox makes that clear in the most direct way possible, by showing that bad beliefs cost you, even when everything else is fair. Rayo's number is a concept that comes from the intersection of mathematics, logic, and philosophy. It represents an attempt to define the largest number that can be precisely described using a fixed set of rules within a given language. The number itself is not meant to be written down in full. In fact, that would be impossible. Instead, it is defined using a logical formula that points to it as the output of a specific process. The idea behind Rayo's number is not to name a huge number in the usual way, like a billion or a Google, but to define a boundary on what can be named or referred to within a formal system. This turns the idea of large numbers into a kind of philosophical thought experiment. The concept was introduced by Agustin Rayo, a philosopher and logician, during a 2007 event called the Big Number Duel. In that event, Rayo and another philosopher, Adam Elgar, tried to outdo each other by describing larger and larger numbers using precise, well-defined descriptions in mathematical language. The point of the duel was not to use arbitrary labels like the biggest number I can think of, but to define numbers using strict logical terms. Each person tried to write a formula or expression that would unambiguously refer to a number that was larger than the one defined by the opponent. At one point, Rayo wrote a definition that went something like this: the smallest number bigger than any number that can be named by a formula of less than 100 symbols in the language of first-order set theory. This statement became known as Rayo's number. It's a paradoxical and clever move. It defines a number that is guaranteed to be bigger than any number you can name using fewer than 100 symbols in a given logical system. Since the definition of Rayo's number itself uses fewer than 100 symbols, it effectively jumps past everything else that can be defined within that system to using similar resources. What makes Rayo's number interesting is not just its size, but the way it challenges our ideas about naming and definition. Most people think of numbers as things you can count or calculate, but Rayo's number is defined by its resistance to being named or described in simpler terms. It's not a number you can find by computing digits. It's a limit to the ability of a formal language to refer to large values. Once you fix a language and a rule for naming things, you can always define a number that's bigger than anything else that can be named under those constraints. Rayo's number is the smallest number that's bigger than all the others that can be referred to in that way. To understand how this works, it helps to compare it to other large numbers. Consider a Google, which is one followed by 100 zeros. That's big, but it can be written easily. A Googleplex is even bigger, one followed by a Google of zeros. Still, that number is specific and clearly defined. Then there are numbers like Graham's number, which comes from a problem in combinatorics. Graham's number is so large that the observable universe does not have enough space to write it out in decimal form. Even if you used one atom for each digit, you would run out of atoms long before you finished. But Graham's number can still be defined using a precise mathematical process. Rayo's number is different. It is not tied to a specific mathematical operation. Instead, it arises from the limitations of language itself. It is defined not by what it is, but by what it isn't, by being larger than any number that can be named in a certain way. This makes it a kind of diagonal argument. In logic and mathematics, diagonalization is a technique used to show that certain sets are uncountable or that certain functions cannot be listed. Rayo's number works similarly. Once you list all the numbers that can be named using a particular rule, you can define a number that's not on that list, even though you're using the same system to define it. This reveals something deep about self-reference and the boundaries of formal systems. It's important to see that Rayo's number depends on the framework in which it's defined. If you allow more symbols, or switch to a different language, or change the rules about what counts as a name or a formula, then the number changes. Rayo's number is not a fixed mathematical object in the way that the number pi is. It is relative to the system in which it is described. That means there is no single version of Rayo's number. There are many versions, each depending on the rules you set for the language and what counts as a legitimate description. This relativism is not a flaw, it's the point. Rayo's number is meant to illustrate that in any formal system, You can only go so far in naming things. There is always a limit, and once you define that limit, you can point to something just beyond it. But that something will require more resources to name. The process can be repeated, but only by stepping outside the original system. This is similar to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any consistent system of arithmetic, there are true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Rayo's number shows that there are numbers that cannot be named within the system, except by referring to the limits of naming itself. Rayo's number is not useful in calculations. You cannot use it to measure anything or solve equations, but it is a powerful idea. It forces us to confront the boundaries of formal thought. It shows that even the simple act of naming a number becomes complex when we apply strict rules. It also shows that no matter how far we go in naming large numbers, we can always go one step further by pointing to the entire process and defining something just beyond it. This leads to an odd effect. The definition of Rayo's number is simple, but the number it names is unimaginably large. It dwarfs any other number that can be named in the same system, yet it is only defined by its position relative to those other numbers. It is not built up from smaller numbers. It is not a calculation. It is a conceptual boundary. Once you accept the rules of the system, you must also accept that this number exists and that it is larger than anything else describable within that frame. This move is related to paradoxes of self-reference, such as the Berry paradox, which asks, what is the smallest number not nameable in fewer than 20 words? If that phrase names the number, then it is nameable in fewer than 20 words, which is a contradiction. Rayo's number avoids direct contradiction, but it plays in the same space. It uses the tools of logic to define a point beyond logic's current reach. It's not an error or a flaw. It's a demonstration of how the structure of language and thought always leaves something out. Rayo's number is a philosophical object more than a mathematical one. It's not about how big a number can be. It's about how we talk about bigness and what it means to define something that can't be named more simply. It teaches that formal systems, no matter how powerful, contain their own ceilings. And once you can see that ceiling, you can use that vision to step just beyond it. The St. Petersburg Paradox is a classic puzzle in probability and economics that shows a strange conflict between expected value and actual human behaviour. It was first introduced by Nicholas Bernoulli in the early 1700s and later discussed by Daniel Bernoulli. The paradox is built around a simple game of chance, but its implications reach into questions about rationality, decision-making, and how people evaluate risk. The game works like this. A player pays a fixed fee to enter, then a fair coin is flipped repeatedly until it comes up heads. The payoff depends on how many flips it takes. If heads comes up on the first flip, the player wins $2. If it takes 2 flips, meaning tails then heads, the player wins $4. If it takes 3 flips, the payout is $8. Each additional flip doubles the potential reward. The payout for n flips is 2 raised to the power of n dollars. The longer it takes to get heads, the more money the player wins. Now calculate the expected value of this game. You take each possible outcome, multiply the payout by its probability, and add the results. The chance of getting heads on the first flip is 1/2, and the payoff is $2, so that adds $1 to the expected value. The chance of tails then heads is 1/4, with a $4 payoff, which adds another $1. Tails, then heads has a 1/8 chance, and pays $8, again adding $1. This pattern continues forever. 1/16th chance of $16, 1/32nd chance of $32, and so on. Each term in the sum is $1. Since there are infinitely many terms, the expected value is infinite. The game's expected monetary value is unbounded. That means, in theory, a rational person should be willing to pay any finite amount to play. But in practice, people are not willing to pay very much to enter this game. Most people would not pay more than $20, and many would not even pay $5. This disconnect is the paradox. The math says the game is worth an infinite amount. Human intuition says it's worth very little. Why the gap? This paradox forces a deeper look at how people evaluate uncertainty. Expected value is the standard method in classical decision theory. It works well in many situations, but in this case, it fails to predict behaviour. The payouts grow so fast that the total sum becomes infinite, but the probability of getting those high payouts shrinks just as fast. It is extremely unlikely that anyone would ever get more than a few flips into the game. Most of the time, the coin lands heads quickly and the payout is small. So while the expected value is infinite, the typical outcome is not very exciting. Daniel Bernoulli proposed a solution using the concept of utility. He suggested that people do not value money in a linear way. Instead, each additional dollar is worth less than the previous one. The idea is that the difference between having $10 and $20 feels bigger than the difference between having 1,000 and 1,010. Bernoulli introduced a utility function to model this. If utility increases logarithmically with wealth, then the expected utility of the St. Petersburg game becomes finite. Using a logarithmic utility function, the expected utility is the sum of the probabilities times the logarithm of the payoff. So you take 1/2 times the log of 2, plus 1/4 times the log of 4, plus 1/8 times the log of 8, and so on. Since the logarithm of 2 to the n is n times the log of 2, this simplifies to a sum where each term is n times log of 2 times 1 over 2 to the n. That sum converges, so the expected utility is finite, even though the expected value is infinite. This resolves the paradox from the perspective of human decision-making. People value utility, not money itself. But this leads to more questions. Why use logarithmic utility? Why not some other function? And what does that say about rationality? The St. Petersburg Paradox reveals that rational decisions are not just about math. They involve psychology, context, and personal preferences. Risk aversion plays a role. People dislike outcomes with high variance, even if the average result is high. The game feels risky because the chance of winning a lot is small, and the likely payout is small too. That mismatch between possible gain and likely outcome drives people away. Some economists argue that the paradox shows the limits of expected value as a decision rule. In real life, people use heuristics, gut instincts, or rules of thumb. They do not run infinite sums in their heads. They weigh risk, trust, and fairness. A game that promises huge payouts, but almost never delivers, feels like a scam. Even when explained, the logic of infinite expected value does not feel compelling. Others point out that the game is not practical. No casino can pay an infinite amount. No player can keep flipping forever. So real versions of the game have limits. Maybe the payout stops at $1 million, or after 100 flips. With such limits, the expected value becomes finite, and closer to what people are willing to pay. This makes the paradox less mysterious. It shows that the infinite value only arises in a world of idealized assumptions. When you apply real-world constraints, the outcome changes. The paradox also connects to insurance and gambling. In both cases, people pay to reduce or accept risk. They make decisions that don't follow strict expected value. A person might buy insurance with negative expected value to avoid rare disasters. A gambler might accept negative expected value for the chance to win big. These behaviors reflect the same patterns seen in the paradox. People care about the shape of outcomes, not just the average. There have been many attempts to refine decision theory to account for this. Some use bounded utility functions, which limit how much value can be placed on extreme outcomes. Others use prospect theory, which models how people weigh gains and losses asymmetrically. Still others propose alternate rules for evaluating risk, such as certainty equivalence or risk-adjusted returns. Each of these tries to capture the fact that real people are not calculators. They think in terms of experience, fear, hope, and habit. The St. Petersburg Paradox remains a powerful teaching tool. It forces people to question basic assumptions about value and choice. It shows that infinite expected value is not the same as infinite worth. It also illustrates that mathematical expectation must be handled with care when dealing with infinite or very large outcomes. The paradox teaches that numbers alone do not tell the whole story. People do not live in a world of pure logic. They live in a world where time, resources, and emotion shape decisions. That makes the paradox less about solving a puzzle and more about understanding the difference between what is rational in theory and what is reasonable in life. Curry's paradox is a logical puzzle that shows how allowing certain kinds of self-reference can lead to absurd conclusions. It is named after the logician Haskell Curry, who worked on the foundations of logic and mathematics in the 20th century. The paradox is not based on contradiction in the usual sense. Instead, it shows that if we accept certain rules of reasoning and allow sentences to refer to themselves in a particular way, then we can prove any conclusion at all, no matter how false or ridiculous. This makes the paradox especially troubling for formal logic systems that try to be both expressive and consistent. To see how the paradox works, consider a sentence that says the following: if this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists. This sentence is not just about Santa Claus, it refers to itself. It says that if it is true, then something else must be true. That makes it self-referential. The logic here seems harmless at first. It is just a conditional statement. We use conditionals all the time. If it rains, then the streets will be wet. If I study, then I will pass the test. But Curry's paradox shows that when self-reference is involved, this familiar pattern of reasoning becomes dangerous. Let's walk through the reasoning step by step. Call the sentence S. S says, if S is true, then Santa Claus exists. Now suppose that S is true, then the condition stated in S must hold. If S is true, then Santa Claus exists. That's what S says. But since we assumed S is true, we apply the implication. So Santa Claus exists. That may seem strange, but so far we just followed the conditional. Now consider the other possibility. What if S is not true? Then we don't get any conclusion. But here's the trick. We can take S and treat it like a logical formula. In logic, we often use a rule called modus ponens. This rule says that if you have if P, then Q, and you know P is true, then you can conclude Q is true. In the case of Curry's paradox, the sentence is, if this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists. If we assume the sentence is true and we accept modus ponens, we must accept that Santa Claus exists. But the conclusion doesn't depend on anything about Santa Claus. It depends only on the structure of the sentence. We could replace Santa Claus exists with any statement. The moon is made of cheese. 5 equals 4. I am the king of Mars. And the same reasoning would go through. That's the heart of the paradox. It lets us derive any result we like, simply by inserting it into the second part of a self-referential conditional. In formal terms, the paradox uses the logical rules of implication and self-reference to break the system. It doesn't need a contradiction in the usual sense. It doesn't say something is both true and false. Instead, it shows that if the system allows this kind of self-reference and follows certain rules of inference, then it becomes trivial, meaning that every statement becomes provable. That is disastrous for any logical system. If everything can be proven, then truth loses all meaning. This is similar to the famous liar paradox, which says this sentence is false. If the sentence is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. That creates a direct contradiction. But Curry's paradox goes further. It doesn't just create a contradiction, it lets us derive arbitrary claims. That's more than just confusing. It destroys the integrity of the system. To avoid the paradox, formal systems have to block something. One option is to prevent self-reference. That's what Alfred Tarski suggested in his work on the theory of truth. Tarski showed that a language cannot contain its own truth predicate without risking paradox. So he built a hierarchy of languages. The base language talks about objects. A higher level language talks about sentences in the base language. That way, no sentence can refer to its own truth. This avoids paradoxes like Curry's. Another option is to restrict the logic itself. Curry's paradox works in classical logic, and also in some non-classical systems. But there are systems, like relevance logic or certain paraconsistent logics, where modus ponens is limited or altered. In those systems, the paradox may not go through. But those changes come at a cost. They make logic less intuitive and hard to use. Some systems restrict the rules of inference for conditionals. For example, you can block certain applications of modus ponens when they involve self-referential conditionals. But that requires fine-tuning the logic in ways that are not always natural. It also weakens the power of the system. Another way to look at the paradox is to focus on the nature of implication. In ordinary language, when we say if P, then Q, we often mean that Q follows from P in some real or causal way. But in formal logic, implication is purely structural. A statement like, if the moon is made of cheese, then 5 equals 4 is considered true if the first part is false or the second part is true. That makes implication flexible, but also vulnerable. Curry's paradox exploits that flexibility. It doesn't depend on truth in the usual sense, it just uses the formal rules of how implication works. This is why Curry's paradox appears in many logical systems. It shows up in systems that try to define truth, in systems that try to model provability, and in systems that handle conditionals. In each case, the core problem is the same. If a sentence can refer to itself and say, if I am true, then Q, then the system can be pushed to derive Q, no matter what Q is. This leads to serious questions about the limits of formal reasoning. What kinds of statements should be allowed? What rules can we trust? How can we build systems that are expressive enough to handle complex ideas, but not so expressive that they collapse under paradox? Curry's paradox is more than a trick. It shows that self-reference, combined with seemingly harmless logical rules, can destroy consistency. It warns us that even simple-looking sentences can be dangerous if the system is not carefully controlled. It also forces us to rethink the relationship between syntax and semantics, between the structure of language and the meaning of truth. In computer science, similar problems appear in systems that try to reason about their own behaviour. A program that says, if I halt, then something impossible happens, can create loops or crashes. In mathematics, proofs that refer to their own provability must be handled with care. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that certain truths about arithmetic cannot be proven within arithmetic. Curry's paradox shows that even more basic logical systems are at risk if they allow too much self-reference. The paradox is not a flaw in logic. It is a feature of how logic behaves under pressure. It teaches us that precision is not always protection. A sentence can follow all the rules and still break the system. That makes Curry's paradox one of the most powerful and unsettling tools in modern logic. It turns ordinary reasoning into a trap, not by twisting facts, but by using the rules exactly as written. The Hole's paradox is a puzzle in metaphysics and philosophy of language. It raises questions about how we talk about absence, how we think about things that are not material, and what it means for something to be real. The paradox begins with a simple and familiar example: a hole in a piece of cheese, or in a shirt, or in the ground. We all recognize holes. We can point at them, describe their shape and size, and even measure them. But holes are not made of anything. They are not objects in the same way that chairs or rocks are. A hole seems to be defined by what is missing, not what is there. This leads to a problem. How can we talk about something that doesn't exist as if it does? Suppose someone says, "There's a hole in my sock." That statement makes sense. You can even locate the hole, describe its edges, or say that it's growing larger. You might say, "The hole is round," or "The hole is 2 centimeters wide." But if a hole is just an absence of sock material, then how can it have a shape or a size? Material things have properties, gaps do not, and yet we treat holes as if they were things. We name them, we give them attributes, We refer to them in speech and writing as if they were ordinary objects. That creates a tension between how language works and how reality seems to work. The wholes paradox emerges when we ask whether wholes are real objects or just ways of talking. If wholes are real, what are they made of? If they're not real, then why does our language treat them as if they are? The philosopher David Lewis famously asked whether wholes are just immaterial objects. If they are, then they raise problems for ontology, the branch of metaphysics that studies what kinds of things exist. Ontology usually deals with physical substances, atoms, people, trees, but if wholes count as things, then our ontology must include absences, voids, or negative space. One version of the paradox comes from trying to define what a whole is. You might say, a whole is the space within a solid where material is missing. But that definition doesn't solve the problem, it just shifts it. Is the whole the empty space? If so, then the whole is the same thing as the region of space that is unfilled. But space is everywhere. The space outside the cheese isn't a whole, so space alone doesn't define the whole. You might say the whole is space bounded by material. But that creates another problem. If you move the cheese, do you move the whole? If the whole is just empty space, then the space stays where it is. But we usually think that the whole moves with the object. If you rotate the cheese, the whole rotates with it. That suggests the whole is not identical to the region of space. It is something more complex. Another way to define a whole is as a property of the object. A whole is not a thing, but a way the object is shaped. The cheese has a hole in it, in the same way it has a rough texture or a yellow colour. This treats the whole as a feature, not an entity. But that also has problems. Features usually depend on matter. A scratch on metal is a deformation of its surface, but a hole is not a deformation, it's a lack. If you remove the cheese around the hole, you just get more hole. If you fill in the hole disappears. That behaviour is strange. Most objects don't vanish when you add material. They grow. Holes shrink or vanish when filled. This leads to more questions. Can two holes be the same? If you punch a hole in a piece of paper, then patch it, and punch another hole in the same place, is it the same hole? That seems unclear. The first hole ceased to exist, the second is new, but they occupy the same space. Do they share identity? If not, then identity must be tied to more than location. Perhaps a hole has a history, but then holes behave like objects again, not just absences. You can also ask whether holes can move. If you drag a drill through a block of wood and keep drilling, the hole changes location. So we say that the hole moves. But what is moving? The absence. That sounds odd. Nothing is moving, yet the location of the absence shifts. This forces us to treat absences as things with motion, which stretches the idea of what counts as an object. The paradox gets sharper in language. Consider the sentence, "The hole in the shirt is larger than the one in the sock." That sentence compares two holes. It assigns size to each. It assumes that holes are the kinds of things that can be compared. But if holes are not things, how can this work? Language allows it, but logic resists. This creates a gap between our way of speaking and our way of thinking. One response is to say that holes are dependent entities. They depend on host objects. A hole in a wall cannot exist without the wall. It has no independent reality. It is not a free-floating object. It exists only as a feature of something else. This view avoids treating holes as full objects, but it still lets us talk about them. Philosophers call this a parasitic view. Holes are parasitic on their hosts. They have location and size because their hosts do, but others argue that this still treats holes too much like things. It opens the door to a crowded ontology, full of shadows, reflections, and silences. Each is an absence, but each behaves like a thing in language. Do we really want to say that all of them exist? Or is this a mistake in how language represents the world? The holes paradox also links to physics. In black hole theory, we use the word hole to describe a region of space from which nothing can escape. But a black hole is not an absence. It is a place where matter is extremely dense. The name is misleading. In that case, the hole is not a gap, but a presence. In contrast, a hole in a vacuum chamber is a literal absence. It lets gas escape. So even in science, the word hole shifts meaning. That adds to the confusion. Some philosophers, like Roberto Casati and Achille Vasi, have explored the logic of holes in detail. They argue that holes are ontologically real. You can count them, locate them, and track them over time. They behave like entities. But others reject this. They say that treating absences as objects is a category mistake. A hole is not a thing. It is a way an object is incomplete. The fact that we can refer to holes does not mean they exist. This debate touches on how language shapes thought. Just because a noun exists in grammar does not mean it names a thing in the world. We talk about nothing, darkness, or the past, but none of these are objects. They are concepts. Holes may fall into the same category. They are useful fictions, ways of organising experience, but the paradox remains. We treat holes as real in daily life. We use them in engineering, design, and measurement. We talk about their number, size, shape, and location, yet they are defined by what is not there. That puts them in a strange category, real in use, unreal in substance. The hole's paradox reveals that the boundary between presence and absence is thinner than it seems. It shows that language and logic can pull in opposite directions, and it forces us to rethink what it means for something to be part of the world. The two-envelope paradox is a problem in probability and decision theory that challenges how we evaluate expected value when reasoning about unknown quantities. The setup is simple, but the reasoning leads to confusion that seems to defy logic. It begins with a choice between two identical envelopes. One of them contains twice as much money as the other. You don't know how much money is in either envelope, but you are allowed to pick one at random. After you pick, you're given the chance to switch to the other envelope before opening yours. The question is, should you switch? At first glance, it seems there's no reason to switch. The envelopes are indistinguishable. You chose randomly. There's no new information. But when you start thinking in terms of expected value, a problem appears. Suppose you choose an envelope and it contains some unknown amount of money. Call this amount X. Now consider the other envelope. It could contain either half of X or twice X. If your envelope is the one with the larger amount, the other envelope has half. If your envelope is the one with the smaller amount, the other has double. Now the paradox arises. If you assume that each case, your envelope being the smaller or the larger, has a 50% chance, then the expected value of switching appears to be more than what you have. Here's how the reasoning goes. There's a 50% chance that the other envelope has half of X, which is 0.5x, and a 50% chance that it has double, which is 2x. The expected value of switching is the average of these outcomes. 0.5 times 0.5x equals 0.25x. 0.5 times 2x equals 1x. Add those and you get 1.25x. This suggests that switching gives you an expected value of 1.25 times what you currently have, so you should switch. But then the same logic applies again. Once you switch, you can apply the same reasoning to go back. This creates a loop. You should always switch, no matter which envelope you have. That can't be right. If switching is always better, even after switching, the reasoning is flawed. You can't always improve your position by doing the same action repeatedly in a closed system. The contradiction shows that something is wrong with the calculation or the assumptions behind it. To understand the mistake, we need to examine the assumption that each case, your envelope being the smaller or the larger, has an equal chance and leads to specific values. That assumption hides a subtle problem. When you say that your envelope contains X and then suppose the other contains either 0.5x or 2x, you are using the same variable X to describe two different situations. In one case, X is the smaller amount. In the other, it's the larger. But those are not symmetrical. The variable X can't represent both the smaller and the larger value in a consistent way. Here's another way to see it. Suppose the envelopes contain fixed amounts, $10 and $20. You pick one and see $10. Now you know that the other envelope must contain $20. Switching is a good idea, but if you see $20, the other envelope must have 10. Switching is a bad idea. In this case, switching depends entirely on which envelope you picked and what it contains. You gain nothing by applying a general rule to always switch. The paradox appears only when you reason about the envelopes without fixed values. Some versions of the paradox don't let you open the envelope before deciding whether to switch. That adds to the uncertainty. But even then, the reasoning breaks down in the same way. You still can't assign meaningful probabilities without knowing the distribution from which the envelope amounts are drawn. That's the core of the problem. The expected value calculation assumes a probability distribution over possible values, but it never specifies what that distribution is. It pretends that any value x could equally likely be the smaller or the larger, which is not possible. If you try to construct a distribution where, for every amount of money there is a 50% chance of it being the smaller and a 50% chance of it being the larger, you run into contradictions. There is no uniform distribution over all positive real numbers. Every possible amount would have to be part of a pair, but the total probability would not add up properly. The math doesn't work. Some versions of the paradox try to fix this by introducing a probability distribution. For example, you could say that the smaller amount is drawn from a specific distribution, like an exponential distribution or a geometric one. Then the larger amount is always double that. Once you specify this structure, you can calculate the actual expected value of switching, and the paradox disappears. In most cases, it turns out that switching is only worthwhile under certain conditions and not universally. There's also a difference between being told that the envelopes were filled in a particular way and assuming it. If the process is unknown or arbitrary, then the expected value argument has no base. It becomes circular. You're reasoning about what you might gain, based on information you don't have, by assuming equal likelihoods that you can't justify. That's why the paradox arises. It's not that switching is better, it's that the reasoning used to support switching is inconsistent. The paradox teaches a broader lesson about probability and decision theory. It shows that expected value alone is not always a reliable guide, especially when your assumptions are vague. Expected value depends on knowing or modelling the underlying process. If that process is hidden or undefined, the calculation may mislead. In the two-envelope case, the reasoning seems to point toward action, always switch, but the outcome does not justify that decision. The paradox reveals a gap between abstract reasoning and grounded decision-making. Another version of the paradox says that if you're offered to switch back and forth repeatedly, you'll never stop. Every time, the expected value appears higher in the other envelope. This infinite loop shows that something is off. Rational decisions don't lead to infinite indecision, they converge. So the loop implies a fault in the assumptions, not in the logic. The structure of the problem is inconsistent. Some philosophers argue that the paradox is not really about probability at all. It's about language and framing. When you describe the situation in terms of unknowns, you build confusion into the problem. If you fix the numbers or the setup, the paradox fades. Others argue that the paradox is real and shows how fragile our reasoning becomes under uncertainty. It highlights the need for clear assumptions and careful modelling. The two-envelope paradox is not just a curiosity. It touches on deep issues in how we reason, how we make decisions, and how we deal with incomplete information. It shows that intuition and formal reasoning can pull in different directions, and it reminds us that, in probability, what you don't know can mislead you more than what you do.